grim darkness of the far future, there are no heroes, no peace, no safety. There is only fear, pain, and war without end. They tell you about the enemies of mankind in the Skolam, the green tide of orcs, the chittering swarms of tyrannids, the corruption of chaos. But there's one nightmare they speak of only in whispers, one terror that even the commissars fear to name aloud. The ones who hunt not for conquest or sustenance, but for the exquisite pleasure of pain itself. The Dark Eldar, raiders from a dimension of suffering, predators who hunt mankind not for conquest, but for cruelty. Welcome back to the abyss. To those who have endured with us through the void, your loyalty keeps this channel alive. For that, I thank you. And to those who are new, beware. Once you enter, there is no escape. Subscribe to Voidborn Terrors and strike the bell so the next nightmare finds you first. Tonight, we descend into that nightmare, into the shadows where you are not just fighting to survive. You are being hunted. Tonight we descend into that nightmare, into the shadows where you are not just fighting to survive. You are being hunted. This is the story of what it means to fall into their web. This is what it feels like when the predators of Commorragh mark you as prey. My name was Trooper Vex Thane of the 47th Cadian Regiment. I survived 17 years of warfare across a dozen worlds. I thought I knew fear. I was wrong. The first thing you need to understand about the void is how alive it feels when death is coming for you. Not alive in any way that brings comfort. Alive like a held breath, like something massive and predatory circling just beyond sight. I was standing watch on the observation deck of the Righteous Vengeance, a Cobra-class destroyer on patrol through the Hadrian system. 3 weeks into what should have been a routine sweep of the outer planets, checking for orc raiders or pirate activity. Standard Imperial Navy business. The kind of deployment that usually meant weeks of boredom, punctuated by brief moments of acceptable violence. The ship hummed around me with the familiar sounds of Imperial engineering, the low thrum of plasma reactors, the distant clatter of boots on metal decking, the occasional vox chatter from the bridge. 60,000 tons of blessed steel and ceramite, armed with torpedo tubes and macro batteries that could crack open a hive city. We were predators in our own right, prowling through the dark between worlds. But something was wrong. I'd felt it for the past 3 days, an itch between my shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. The kind of sensation that had kept me alive through the siege of Mordax Prime, through the tunnel fights on Genna 7. Every veteran learns to trust that feeling, the one that whispers danger when everything else seems normal. Commissar Valdris had dismissed it when I'd mentioned it during morning prayers. Trooper Thane, he'd said in that clipped accent of his, the Emperor protects those who do their duty without complaint. Your unease serves no purpose but to spread weakness among the ranks. Easy words from a man who'd never had to dig orc chopper blades out of his ribs. But Valdris was right about one thing. Talking about it would only make the others nervous. The 150 guardsmen aboard were already on edge. 3 weeks in the void does that to ground pounders like us, used to having solid earth beneath our boots and a sky overhead instead of endless dark. I pressed my palm against the armored viewport, feeling the slight vibration that ran through the ship's hull. Beyond the thick crystal, space stretched out in all directions, not the clean void of the recruitment posters, but a murky darkness filled with debris fields and drifting asteroids. The Hadrian system was old, scarred by millennia of warfare. Dead ships floated out there, Imperial and Xenos alike, their hulks picked clean by salvage crews, or left to drift until the end of time. Throne, muttered Guardsman Kell, joining me at the viewport. He was young, maybe 19, with the pale complexion of a hive-worlder. This was his first deployment off-world, and it showed in the way he jumped at every unfamiliar sound. Look at all those wrecks. How many ships do you think died out here? Enough, I said, not wanting to spook him further. But I'd been counting them myself during my watches. Dozens of twisted metal corpses, some still glowing faintly with residual radiation. The void was a graveyard, and we were sailing through it like mourners at a funeral. That's when I saw it. A flicker at the edge of my vision, there and gone so fast I might have imagined it. I pressed closer to the viewport, my breath fogging the crystal as I strained to see into the darkness. "What is it?" Kel asked, following my gaze. "Probably nothing," I said, but my hand had already moved to the Vox bead at my collar. "Bridge, this is Thane on observation duty. I'm seeing movement in grid 77 Alpha." The response came back immediately, crackling with static. "Observation deck, this is Lieutenant Commorragh. Auspex shows nothing in that sector. Are you certain?" I stared out into the void, watching shadows that might have been debris, might have been asteroids, might have been nothing at all. The feeling between my shoulder blades was getting stronger, like someone had drawn a targeting sight on my spine. Negative, Bridge. False alarm. But it wasn't, and I knew it. Something was out there in the dark, pacing us just beyond our sensor range. Something that had learned to move through the void like a predator stalking through tall grass. Kel was still staring out the viewport when the lights began to flicker. Just for a moment, a brief stuttering of the luminators that could have been a power fluctuation, a minor glitch in the ship's electrical systems. Except that the righteous vengeance had been blessed by the tech priests of Mars. Her machine spirits were strong and true. She didn't have glitches. "Did you see that?" Kel whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. In the brief darkness between the flickers, I could have sworn I'd seen something move past the viewport. Something long and sinuous, like a serpent made of shadow and razored metal. The Vox crackled again. "All stations, this is the bridge. We're picking up minor interference on long-range augers. Maintain standard watch protocols." Interference. A clean technical word for something that was anything but clean. I'd heard enough Vox traffic in my years of service to know when officers were worried and trying not to show it. Lieutenant Corrin's voice had that tight quality that meant he was seeing things on his instruments that didn't belong there. "Thane." Kel's voice was small, uncertain. "You think we're in trouble?" I wanted to tell him no, that it was just void sickness playing tricks on our minds, that the Imperial Navy had been patrolling these routes for 10,000 years without incident. I wanted to lie to him, the way Commissar Valdris had lied to me that morning. Instead, I checked the charge on my laser gun and made sure my combat knife was loose in its sheath. "Stay alert, Guardsman," I said, "and if anything moves out there that isn't supposed to, you sing out loud enough to wake the Emperor himself." The lights flickered again, longer this time. In that moment of darkness, I saw them clearly, sleek shapes sliding through the void like sharks through black water, keeping pace with our ship. They were beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, elegant, purposeful, designed for nothing but killing. When the lights came back on, they were gone, but the feeling between my shoulder blades had become a scream of warning that I could no longer ignore. We were being hunted, and somewhere in the dark between the stars, our hunters were getting ready to feed. The next 12 hours passed like a fever dream, punctuated by moments of crystal clear terror. Sleep didn't come when I tried to catch a few hours in my bunk. Instead, I lay on the narrow cot, listening to the ship around me. The creaks and groans of metal under stress, the whisper of recycled air through the ventilation systems, the distant sound of boots on deck plating. Familiar sounds that should have been comforting but weren't. Everything felt wrong, like a song played slightly off-key. At 0347 ship time, the alarm klaxons started screaming. I was up and grabbing my gear before the first blast faded, muscle memory taking over. Around me, the barracks erupted into controlled chaos as 150 guardsmen rolled out of their bunks and began the practice dance of emergency deployment. Flak armor pulled on over regulation undershirts, laser guns snatched from wall racks, ammunition packs checked and double-checked. "Form up! Form up!" Sergeant Voss was bellowing over the noise, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in the Guard. "This is not a drill! Combat equipment, double time." The Vox speakers crackled to life with the crisp voice of Captain Thorne, the ship's commanding officer. "All hands to battle stations. We have multiple contacts bearing down on our position. Imperial Guard squads report to designated defensive positions. This is not a drill. Multiple contacts." The words sent ice through my veins as I clipped my ammunition pouches to my belt. In naval terminology, contacts meant ships. Plural meant we were outnumbered. I followed the stream of guardsmen rushing toward our assigned battle stations, boots clanging on metal decking as we navigated the ship's cramped corridors. The righteous vengeance had been built for war, every inch of her designed around the principle of bringing death to the Emperor's enemies. But she'd also been designed with the assumption that her enemies would fight like civilized beings, ship-to-ship combat at respectable distances, following the established patterns of naval warfare that had served the Imperium for 10 millennia. The creatures hunting us had never learned those rules. My squad's assignment was Defense Position 7, a fortified checkpoint near the ship's primary ammunition magazines. If boarders made it through the hull, and with the klaxons screaming, that seemed increasingly likely. Our job was to keep them away from anything that could turn the righteous vengeance into a brief, bright star. We reached the position just as the ship shuddered around us, a bone-deep vibration that I felt in my teeth. Not the familiar kick of our own weapons firing, but something else, the sensation of foreign objects impacting our hull. "Boarding torpedoes," muttered Corporal Hayes, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the ritual scars of his homeworld. "Throne preserve us, they're coming aboard." Through the reinforced viewport of our defensive position, I could see flashes of light in the void, not the clean, bright flashes of Imperial weapons, but something stranger. Sickly green illumination that seemed to writhe and pulse like something alive. And threading through that light, I caught glimpses of our attackers' ships. They were nothing like any vessel I'd seen in 17 years of warfare. Where Imperial ships were built like cathedrals, massive, imposing, festooned with spires and Gothic ornamentation, these craft were predators given form, long knife-edged hulls that seemed to slice through space itself, too sleek and fast to be entirely real. They moved with a liquid grace that made my eyes water to follow, appearing and disappearing like mirages in a heat haze. "Dark Eldar," whispered Guardsman Kell, and I heard the fear naked in his voice. "Emperor, protect us. It's the Dark Eldar." I'd heard the stories, of course. Every Imperial citizen had. Whispered tales of raiders from the dark city of Commorragh, predators who hunted humans not for territory or resources, but for the simple joy of causing pain. They were bogeymen from the outer darkness, the kind of monsters parents used to frighten children into obedience. Except they weren't stories. They were real, and they were here. The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the distinctive whine of lass weapons firing short, desperate bursts that spoke of close-quarters combat. Our shipmates were already fighting for their lives in corridors, just like the one we occupied. "Contacts in Section C," the Vox crackled with panicked reports from across the ship. "They're moving too fast. We can't track them." Section F reporting heavy casualties. They're not just killing, they're taking prisoners. Bridge, this is Lieutenant Morse in engineering. Something's wrong with the lights down here. They keep going out, but there's nothing wrong with the power grid. That last report made my blood run cold. Darkness was their ally, their natural element. In the black between stars, they were apex predators. On an Imperial ship filled with corridors and corners and shadows, they would be unstoppable. Squad, sound off, Sergeant Voss ordered over the Vox. Report status. One by one, the defensive positions checked in. Most were still intact, still waiting for enemies that hadn't arrived yet. But Defense Position 3 reported taking fire from shapes in the ventilation shafts, and Defense Position 12 had gone silent entirely. The waiting was the worst part. In a proper firefight, you had targets to shoot at, objectives to achieve, clear ways to contribute to victory or die trying. This was different. This was being prey, huddled in our holes while predators stalked through our ship. Movement, Hayes hissed, pressing his eye to the rifle scope mounted on his laser gun. Corridor junction, bearing 270. I swung my own weapon toward the indicated direction, squinting through the dim illumination of the emergency lighting. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then shadow moved within shadow, and I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, tall, impossibly slender, moving with a predator's fluid grace. Its armor was a deep, lustrous black that seemed to drink in the light around it, and its helmet was sculpted into the likeness of some nightmare creature from ancient myth. But what struck me most was the way it moved. Not like a human in powered armor, clumsy and mechanical, but like a dancer, like something that had been born to kill and took exquisite pleasure in the act. Contact! Contact! Hayes was shouting into his Vox even as he opened fire. His laser gun spat coherent light down the corridor, the beam painting stark shadows on the bulkheads. The figure simply wasn't there anymore. One moment it had been advancing toward our position with that hypnotic predatory stride. The next, it had flowed aside like smoke, avoiding Hayes' shot by inches. I tracked it with my own weapon, finger tightening on the trigger, but couldn't find a clear target. It moved too fast, too fluidly, dancing between shadows like they were old friends. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness fell over our section of the ship like a suffocating blanket. I could hear my squad mates breathing, could hear the nervous whisper of equipment being adjusted, but I couldn't see anything. The emergency lighting should have kicked in within seconds, but nothing happened. Night vision, Voss ordered, his voice tight with controlled fear. I fumbled for the night vision goggles clipped to my belt, hands shaking more than I cared to admit. The familiar weight of the device settled over my eyes, and the world turned into a landscape of green ghosts and flickering shadows. That's when I saw them. They were everywhere. The corridor that had been empty moments before was now filled with moving shapes, tall, elegant figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. They flowed through the darkness like liquid death, and even through the night vision equipment, they were difficult to track. They moved with purpose, with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. "Open fire!" Voss roared. The corridor exploded into chaos. Laser gun beams strobed through the darkness, painting everything in stark relief for split seconds at a time. I squeezed my trigger and saw my shot strike the chest of one of the figures, a hit that should have punched through armor and flesh and dropped any normal enemy. Instead, the figure staggered slightly, then turned toward me with what I can only describe as amusement. Through my night vision goggles, I could see its helmet had been styled into the likeness of a grinning skull, and for one terrifying moment, I thought that skull was laughing at me. Then something struck me in the chest, Not a killing blow, but something that sent electric pain shooting through my nervous system. I dropped my laser gun and fell to my knees, muscles spasming uncontrollably. Around me, I could hear my squad mates crying out as similar weapons found their marks. Splinter weapons, I realized through the haze of pain. The Dark Eldar didn't want to kill us quickly. They wanted us alive, paralyzed, helpless. They wanted us to suffer. As consciousness faded, I heard something that would haunt whatever remained of my life. The sound of laughter. Not human laughter, but something more musical and infinitely more cruel. The laughter of predators who had cornered their prey and were preparing to feast. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was a figure approaching through the green haze of my night vision goggles. Tall, graceful, terrible in its alien beauty. It reached down toward me with hands encased in gauntlets that ended in razor-sharp talons. And those talons were already stained with blood. I came back to consciousness in hell, not the metaphorical hell that preachers warn about during Sunday services in the regimental chapels. This was something far more immediate and physical, a reality of pain and terror that no human mind was equipped to process. The first sensation was the cold, not the clean cold of void space or the bite of winter air, but something clammy and wrong that seemed to seep into my bones. I was lying on metal decking, which was familiar, but the air tasted like blood, and ozone, and something else. A sweet, cloying scent that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Whatever they'd hit me with had left my nervous system feeling like I'd been struck by lightning. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest as I forced myself upright, and for a moment, the world spun sickeningly around me. That's when I saw what they'd done to Kell. The young guardsman was hanging from the ceiling about 10 feet away, suspended by chains that seemed to grow directly out of the ship's hull. At first glance, he looked almost peaceful, head tilted back, arms spread wide like he was embracing the void itself. Then I realized he had no skin. They'd flayed him with surgical precision, peeling away every inch of flesh while somehow keeping him alive. His raw muscle gleamed wetly in the dim light, and I could see his heart beating frantically in his exposed chest cavity. Worse still, his eyes were open and aware, following my movement with desperate, pleading intelligence. He was still alive. After what they'd done to him somehow, he was still alive. "Ah, you're awake." The voice came from behind me, melodic and cultured, speaking perfect low Gothic with an accent I couldn't place. How delightful. We were beginning to think the paralytic had been too strong. I turned slowly, every instinct screaming at me to move faster, but my body refused to cooperate. The figure standing in the shadows was unmistakably one of our attackers, tall, impossibly slender, dressed in form-fitting armor that seemed to absorb light. But this one had removed its helmet, revealing features that were both beautiful and terrible. She, I realized, had the classical beauty of ancient statuary, with high cheekbones and elegant features that would have been perfect on a human woman. But her skin was pale as snow. Her eyes were pools of absolute darkness without visible pupils, and when she smiled, I saw teeth filed to razor points. "I am Serene Blood Whisper," she said, moving with that fluid grace I'd observed during the attack. "And you, Monkey, are about to provide me with exquisite entertainment." Monkey. I'd heard the term before, in intelligence briefings about Xenos species. It was what the Eldar called humans, a word that meant something like lesser being or animal. Coming from her lips, it sounded like a curse. "Your friend there," she continued, gesturing casually toward Kell's suspended form, "has been quite vocal about his discomfort. Humans are so wonderfully expressive when properly motivated. I tried to speak, to curse her or threaten her, or at least say something defiant, but my throat felt like I'd been gargling with broken glass. The best I could manage was a hoarse croak. "Don't strain yourself," Serene said, crouching down beside me with predatory interest. "The paralytic affects the vocal cords, among other things. But don't worry, the effects are temporary. I do so prefer my subjects to be able to scream properly." Around us, I could hear sounds that confirmed my worst fears. Somewhere in the distance, a human voice was screaming, not in pain or fear, but in the kind of absolute despair that comes from having your mind broken into fragments. Closer, I could hear wet sounds that might have been someone being dissected while still conscious. "Your ship was delightfully easy to take," Serene continued conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "Imperial vessels are so predictable, so clumsy. Your weapon systems were disabled within minutes, your crew scattered like insects when the lights went out. Really, it was almost disappointing. I managed to get enough air into my lungs to wheeze out a single word. Why?" Her smile widened, showing more of those filed teeth. "Why what, little Monkey? Why did we take your ship? Why are we keeping you alive? Why am I explaining this to you instead of simply beginning your education in suffering?" She stood and began pacing around me like a predator circling wounded prey. Each step was perfectly silent despite her armored boots, and I had the unsettling impression that she could have walked across a field of broken glass without making a sound. "We took your ship because we could," she said. "Because it amused us to do so. Because somewhere in the dark between stars, we saw your pathetic little vessel and decided that today would be a good day to hunt." She paused directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the scent rising from her armor, something like expensive perfume mixed with old blood. "We're keeping you alive because dead meat provides no entertainment. Oh, we'll kill some of you eventually, of course. But properly seasoned despair has such a wonderful flavor, and humans are particularly good at producing it when they realize there's no hope of rescue." Behind her, Kel made a sound that might have been an attempt at speech. The muscles of his throat were working frantically, but without vocal cords, they'd probably removed those, along with everything else. He could only produce a wet, gurgling noise. "As for why I'm explaining this to you," Serene continued, turning to admire her handiwork, "it's because anticipation adds such wonderful spice to the eventual feast. You see, little Monkey, fear has layers. There's the sharp, immediate fear of physical pain, which is quite satisfying. But beneath that lies something much more nourishing, the deep, existential terror that comes from understanding exactly how helpless you are." She walked over to Kel's suspended form and traced one razor-sharp fingernail along his exposed ribs. Even without skin, I could see his muscles tense in agony. "Your friend here understands," she said. "He's moved beyond simple pain into that deeper realm of despair. Can you see it in his eyes? The moment when hope dies and is replaced by the sure knowledge that suffering is all that remains." I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something about the scene held me transfixed, not fascination, but the terrible compulsion that makes you stare at accident scenes or watch buildings burn. Kel's eyes had indeed changed. The desperate plea I'd seen earlier was gone, replaced by something flat and empty. He'd given up. After whatever they'd done to him, he'd simply given up. "But you," Serene said, turning back to me with renewed interest, "you're still fighting, aren't you? I can see it in the way you hold yourself, the way you're cataloging potential weapons and escape routes, even though you can barely stand. 17 years in the Imperial Guard, according to your identification tags. A survivor." She knelt beside me again, close enough that I could see my own terrified reflection in her black eyes. "Survivors are my specialty," she whispered. "There's something exquisite about watching someone who has overcome every challenge, survived every battle, finally reach the moment when they realize that this time there truly is no way out. The sound they make when that realization hits them, it's better than music." From somewhere deeper in the ship, I heard a new sound. Human voices raised, not in screams, but in laughter. Wild, hysterical laughter that spoke of minds pushed beyond their breaking points. Our captors weren't just torturing people. They were driving them insane for entertainment. "Listen to that," Serene said dreamily. "Your shipmates are discovering new depths of experience. We have such wonderful games planned for all of you. Mazes where the walls move and the floors are made of living flesh. Arenas where you'll fight each other for our amusement, knowing that the winner's only reward is to live long enough to face the next challenger. Chambers, where time moves differently, where a moment of pain can last for subjective hours." She stood and walked toward the corridor entrance, her movements as graceful as ever. But before she left, she turned back to deliver one final observation. "The beautiful thing about despair, little Monkey, is that it's not a destination. It's a journey. And we have such a long journey ahead of us." The lights went out as she disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with Kel's gurgling attempts at speech and the distant sounds of human suffering. But in those last moments before darkness fell, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Along the walls of the chamber, arranged like obscene decorations, were dozens of flayed corpses. Men and women in the uniforms of the Imperial Navy and Guard, all skinned with the same surgical precision, all still somehow alive and aware. And carved into the metal above each one was a number, as if someone was keeping score. I was in a collection, a museum of human suffering where I was about to become the newest exhibit. The darkness was absolute, but it couldn't hide the sound of Kel trying to weep without tear ducts, or the wet noise of his heart beating in his exposed chest, or the soft whisper of footsteps returning down the corridor. My education in despair was about to begin. Time becomes meaningless when you're trapped in hell. I don't know how long I spent in that chamber of horrors. Hours, days, perhaps weeks. The Dark Eldar had done something to the ship's chronometer systems, or maybe they'd just moved us somewhere else entirely. There were no windows to show the passage of stars, no regular shifts to mark the hours. There was only the endless darkness punctuated by moments of sickly illumination when our captors came to visit. They never touched me during those early visits. Instead, they seemed content to let me watch as they worked on the others. New prisoners arrived regularly, crewmen from the Righteous Vengeance dragged in chains or paralyzed by splinter weapons. I learned to recognize the sound of their approach, the whisper of bare feet on metal deck plating, the musical clink of blades and hooks and instruments whose purpose I didn't want to imagine. Each new arrival followed the same pattern. First came the paralysis, the helpless period where you could only lie there and absorb the magnitude of what had happened. Then came the preparation. The Dark Eldar approached suffering like artists approaching a canvas, with careful attention to technique and composition. Guardsman Torres lasted 3 days before his mind broke. They'd suspended him upside down and opened small cuts all along his body. Nothing fatal, nothing that would end his torment quickly, just dozens of tiny wounds that wept blood constantly. The point wasn't to kill him, but to demonstrate their absolute control over his existence. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of consciousness was theirs to grant or take away. On the 3rd day, he began laughing. Not the hysterical laughter I'd heard from other parts of the ship, but something worse. A quiet, continuous chuckling that spoke of a mind that had simply decided to retreat into madness rather than process what was happening to it. That's when they lost interest in him. I was beginning to understand their psychology, if psychology was even the right word for creatures like these. They weren't sadists in the way humans understood the term. Sadism implied a certain emotional investment in causing pain, a twisted but recognizable desire to dominate and control. These things were something else entirely. They approached suffering the way a connoisseur approaches fine wine, with educated palates that could distinguish between subtle varieties of agony, with sophisticated tastes that demanded increasingly complex presentations. Terror was their cuisine, and they were gourmets. "You're learning," said a voice from the darkness. I tensed, recognizing the melodic tones of Serene Bloodwhisper. She'd been absent for what felt like days, leaving her underlings to tend the collection while she attended to other business. Her return meant that my period of observation was coming to an end. Learning what? I managed to croak. My voice was getting stronger as the paralytic wore off, but it still sounded like I'd been gargling with broken glass. "To see us as we truly are," she replied, stepping into the dim light cast by bioluminescent strips that ran along the ceiling. "Not as monsters or demons or any of the other crude labels your species uses to categorize things beyond your understanding. We are artists, little Mon-Ki, practitioners of the most ancient and refined of all arts." She walked over to Torres, who was still hanging upside down, still chuckling softly to himself. With casual disdain, she reached up and snapped his neck with a single, precise motion. The laughter stopped immediately. "Crude work," she said, examining her fingernails as if checking for bloodstains. "My apprentices lack subtlety. They think volume equals quality, that screaming loudly is the same as singing beautifully. But you..." She turned toward me with renewed interest. "You haven't screamed at all, have you? Haven't begged or pleaded or offered to betray your comrades in exchange for a quick death? Most refreshing." I didn't respond, partly because I didn't trust my voice, but mostly because I was trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Torres had been a good soldier, not brilliant maybe, but steady and reliable. The kind of man you wanted next to you in a firefight, and she'd killed him with no more thought than swatting a fly. "I've been reviewing your service record," Serene continued, producing a data slate that looked nothing like Imperial technology. The screen showed information in flowing, alien script that hurt my eyes to look at directly. 17 years in the Guard, as I mentioned, but what interests me are the specifics. She began pacing again, that predatory stride that never seemed hurried but covered ground with frightening efficiency. "Mordax Prime, where you held the eastern gate against a Wa for 6 hours with only half a squad. Genna 7, where you spent 3 weeks fighting orc tunnel rats in the Underhive. The cleansing of Hadron's world, where you were one of only 12 survivors from a regiment of 3,000. Each name hit me like a physical blow. Those weren't just battles, they were nightmares that I'd spent years trying to forget. Worlds where good soldiers had died in ways that would haunt their families for generations. The kind of meat grinder campaigns that turn human beings into walking shells of scar tissue and survivors' guilt. You have an impressive capacity for surviving the unsurvivable, she observed. But more than that, you have something much rarer, the ability to retain your sanity in situations that would break lesser minds. Do you know how rare that is among your species? I did know, actually. I'd seen too many good soldiers crack under pressure, watched brave men and women suddenly start gibbering about seeing things that weren't there, or hearing voices that only existed in their own heads. Combat stress, the medics called it. Shell shock, battle fatigue. clinical terms for the simple fact that human minds weren't designed to process the kind of horrors that warfare in the 41st millennium could produce. Most humans, Serene continued, have a breaking point. Push them hard enough, apply the right combination of physical pain and psychological pressure, and they simply snap, like dry wood under too much stress. But you bend without breaking. You adapt. You endure. She stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see my own terrified face reflected in her black eyes. That makes you incredibly valuable. Not as a subject for casual torture. Any apprentice can flay skin or break bones. No, you're raw material for something much more sophisticated. From the corridor beyond, I could hear new sounds. Not screams this time, but something worse. Human voices raised in what sounded like singing, but with harmonies that no human throat should have been able to produce. The Dark Eldar weren't just torturing our people. They were changing them. "You're going to help us with an experiment," Serene said, her smile revealing those filed teeth. "We're curious about the limits of human adaptability. How much can a mind endure before it transforms into something entirely new? How far can consciousness be stretched before it becomes something other than human?" She gestured toward the shadows at the far end of the chamber, and for the first time, I noticed that things were moving there. Shapes that had once been human, but were now something else. Creatures that writhed and whispered in voices that sounded like wind through broken glass. "Previous subjects," she explained casually. "Volunteers from your ship's crew who have graduated to a higher form of existence. They retain just enough of their original consciousness to remember what they used to be, which adds such delightful layers of anguish to their current state." One of the shapes turned toward us, and I saw what had once been Lieutenant Corrin, the bridge officer who'd dismissed my warnings about movement in the void. His body had been rearranged. Extra limbs had been grafted onto his torso, and his head had been split open to accommodate additional eyes that wept constant tears of blood. When he opened his mouth to speak, the sound that emerged was like a choir of the damned singing a lullaby. "Please," the thing that had been Corrin whispered, in a voice that somehow harmonized with itself. "Please don't let me remember what I was. The remembering is the worst part." Serene laughed, a sound like silver bells being dropped into a grave. "But my dear Lieutenant, the remembering is the entire point. Without memory, transformation is just change. With memory, it becomes exquisite torment." She turned back to me, her dark eyes glittering with anticipation. "And that, little monkey, is what awaits you. Not death. Death is simple, quick, final. No, we're going to help you become something new. Something that will remember exactly what it used to be and will spend eternity screaming about it." The paralytic had worn off enough for me to clench my fists, and I felt my fingernails digging into my palms hard enough to draw blood. The pain was clean and immediate, nothing like the sophisticated agonies the Dark Eldar specialized in, but mine nonetheless. "When?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Soon," Serene replied, "but not yet. First comes the preparation phase. We need to map your psychological landscape, identify the specific fears and desires that make you uniquely yourself. Everyone breaks differently, you see. Some collapse when confronted with physical pain, others when forced to watch their comrades suffer. Some can endure anything except isolation, while others crumble when exposed to too much stimulation." She gestured, and two of her subordinates emerged from the shadows. They were smaller than she was, more heavily armored, with helmets that had been crafted to resemble screaming faces. Each carried an array of instruments that I couldn't identify, but that made my skin crawl just to look at. "These are my racks," Serene explained. "Apprentice flesh sculptors who will be conducting your preliminary evaluation. They're not as skilled as I am. Their techniques tend toward the crude and obvious, but they're quite thorough. The Raks approached with that same fluid grace I'd observed in all the Dark Eldar, but theirs was different somehow. Where Serene moved like a dancer, these creatures moved like surgeons, precise, methodical, terrifyingly focused. "Now," Serene said, settling into what looked like a chair made from polished bones and stretched skin. "Let's discover what makes you scream." The first Rak knelt beside me and began laying out its instruments with the care of a craftsman preparing for important work. Blades of impossible sharpness, needles that seemed to bend light around them, devices that hummed with barely contained energy. Each tool was a work of art in its own right, beautiful and terrible, and designed for no purpose except causing pain. "We'll start with something simple," the creature said, in a voice like grinding metal. "A basic pain response test to establish your baseline tolerance." It selected a blade about the length of my hand, its edge so sharp it seemed to cut the air itself. Without warning, it drew the blade across my forearm, not deep enough to sever anything vital, but deep enough that blood began flowing immediately. The pain was incredible, not just because of the cut itself, but because the blade had been treated with something that amplified nerve response. What should have been a minor wound felt like being branded with a white-hot iron. I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste blood, determined not to give them the satisfaction of hearing me cry out. But the second Rak was already moving, selecting a needle from its collection and testing its point against the palm of its hand. "Interesting," it hissed. "High pain tolerance, but not superhuman." The subject attempts to suppress vocal responses through self-inflicted distraction. Note the blood on the tongue. The needle plunged into my shoulder, hitting a nerve cluster with surgical precision. This time I couldn't suppress the scream that tore from my throat, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the chamber's metal walls. "Much better," Serene said approvingly. "You see? Everyone sings eventually. It's just a matter of finding the right instrument." They worked on me for hours after that, mapping every nerve ending, cataloging every response, building what they called my pain profile with scientific thoroughness. But the physical torture was just the beginning. The real horror came when they started probing for psychological weaknesses. "Tell us about Mordax's Prime," one of the Raks commanded, its needle poised over my eye. "Tell us about the comrades you failed to save." I tried to remain silent, but they had ways of making speech involuntary. Drugs that loosened the tongue, electric stimulation that bypassed conscious control, and techniques that had been refined over millennia of practice. Before long, I was telling them everything. Every mission that had gone wrong, every friend I'd watched die, every moment of doubt and fear and survivor's guilt that I'd carried for 17 years. They drank it in like wine, savoring each revelation of weakness or failure. But what disturbed me most was their clinical detachment. They weren't gloating or celebrating my pain. They were studying it, analyzing it, adding it to some vast catalogue of human suffering for future reference. "Fascinating," Serene murmured as the session finally ended. "Classic survivor's syndrome with unusually strong compartmentalization abilities. You've learned to isolate traumatic memories to preserve functionality, but the memories are still there, still accessible with proper stimulation." The Raks began packing up their instruments with the same methodical care they'd shown in laying them out. My body felt like one massive wound, nothing life-threatening, nothing that would heal quickly, but dozens of small injuries that would remind me of this session for days to come. "This has been most educational," Serene said, rising from her bone chair with that fluid grace. "But I'm afraid our time is almost up. You see, We've reached the edge of the system, and it's time to return home. Home. The word sent ice through my veins because I knew exactly what she meant. Commorragh, the dark city, the nightmare realm where creatures like her were born and raised and taught to see suffering as the highest form of art. But don't worry, little Monkey, she continued, moving toward the chamber's exit. Your real education is just beginning. What you've experienced here is merely orientation, a taste of things to come. As she reached the doorway, she paused and turned back for one final observation. In Commorragh, we have a saying, the hunt never truly ends. It only changes venues. You've been prey in the darkness between stars, hunted through the corridors of your own ship. But soon you'll discover what it means to be prey in a city built entirely for predators. The lights went out as she disappeared, leaving me alone with the transformed remnants of my shipmates and the knowledge that this had all been just the beginning. Somewhere in the darkness, the thing that had been Lieutenant Corin was weeping in harmonies that human vocal cords should never have been able to produce. And from the corridor beyond came a new sound. The rumble of massive engines powering up, the distinctive vibration of a ship preparing to enter some form of faster-than-light travel. We were leaving the material universe behind, departing for a realm where the very concept of hope was just another instrument in an orchestra of despair. The hunt was moving to its final hunting ground. The transition into the webway was like being swallowed by a living nightmare. I'd experienced warp travel before, of course. Every Imperial citizen who'd ever left their birth world knew the peculiar sensation of reality folding in on itself as the ship's Geller field carved a bubble of sanity through the raw chaos of the immaterium. There was always a moment during translation when your soul seemed to separate from your body, when you could hear whispers in languages that predated human civilization. This was different. This was worse. Where warp travel felt like diving into an ocean of madness, the webway felt like being fed into the digestive system of some cosmic predator. The walls of my prison chamber seemed to become translucent, revealing corridors of impossible geometry that twisted and folded through dimensions I couldn't name. Through those translucent barriers, I could see other ships, sleek predatory vessels that moved through the interdimensional passages like sharks through blood-warm water. We were part of a fleet, a hunting pack returning home with their prize. The transformed remnants of my shipmates reacted to the transition with sounds that barely qualified as human. Lieutenant Curran's multiple voices rose in a discordant harmony that spoke of souls being stretched across dimensional boundaries. The other things that had once been my comrades writhed and twisted in their restraints, their additional limbs and organs responding to stimuli that existed only in the space between spaces. Beautiful, isn't it? Serene's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the webway itself was speaking. The ancient roads built by our ancestors, paths that connect every corner of the galaxy through dimensions your primitive science cannot even conceive. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her presence like a cold weight pressing against my consciousness. The webway was her natural element, a realm where predators like her could move instantly between worlds, appearing without warning to harvest fresh prey. Your Imperium believes space travel requires massive engines and months or years of journey time, she continued, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. How quaint. We've been moving between stars since before your species learned to make fire, using roads that exist outside the physical universe entirely. Through the transparent walls, I caught glimpses of impossible vistas, cities that hung in the void like jeweled spiders' webs, forests of metallic trees that sang with voices like crystal chimes, oceans of liquid shadow that reflected stars from universes that no longer existed. The webway wasn't just a transportation network. It was an entire dimension, a space between spaces where reality followed rules that had been written by alien minds. But even here, in this realm of wonders, I could sense the corruption. The passages we traveled through were scarred and twisted, marked by eons of use by creatures who understood beauty only in terms of suffering. What might once have been pristine highways had become arteries for a civilization that fed on pain. "We're almost home," Serene said, and now I could see her approaching through the dimensional haze. She moved through the webway like a dancer performing steps choreographed before time began, utterly at ease in surroundings that would have driven most humans insane. "Soon you'll see Commorragh in all its terrible glory." The name alone was enough to make my blood run cold. I'd heard stories, of course, whispered accounts from inquisitors and rogue traders who claimed to have glimpsed the dark city from afar, a metropolis built in the spaces between realities, a realm where torture was architecture and suffering was currency. "Tell me," Serene said, settling into her bone chair as casually as if we were having tea in a civilized parlor. "What do you think you'll find there?" I didn't answer immediately, partly because my throat still felt like broken glass, but mostly because I was trying to process what I was seeing through the chamber's translucent walls. We'd entered what looked like a tunnel, a passage lined with structures that might have been buildings or might have been living organisms. They pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly, and I had the disturbing impression that they were watching us pass. "Arenas," I finally managed to croak. "Torture chambers. Places where people, practice your arts." Serene laughed. That sounded like silver bells falling into a grave. "Oh, my dear little Monkey, you think so small. Yes, we have arenas and laboratories and studios where pain is refined into its purest forms. But Commorragh is so much more than that." She gestured toward the walls, and the translucency increased until they were nearly invisible. Now I could see our destination clearly, a city that defied every law of physics and sanity. It stretched in all directions without regard for up or down, a maze of spires and platforms that existed in at least 4 dimensions simultaneously. Some structures hung in the void without any visible support, while others were built into surfaces that curved through angles that shouldn't exist. The architecture was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, elegant, purposeful, designed to inspire awe and terror in equal measures. And it was vast, not just a large infinite. The city seemed to extend through dimensional layers, like a cancer growing through reality itself. Wherever I looked, there were more towers, more platforms, more impossible structures receding into distances that the human eye couldn't measure. "Home," Serene said with obvious pride. "The greatest achievement of our species, built in the spaces where reality is thin. A city outside time, beyond the reach of death itself." As we drew closer, I began to make out details that made my sanity recoil. The towers weren't just built, they were grown, shaped from materials that looked disturbingly organic. Many of them were decorated with what I first took to be artistic sculptures, until I realized they were living beings frozen in moments of perfect agony. Humans, Eldar, creatures I couldn't identify, all transformed into architectural elements that would scream for eternity. "The Screaming Gallery," Serene noted following my gaze. "One of our older districts. The inhabitants have been singing the same song of despair for over 3,000 years. You can hear it from orbit if you know how to listen." Our ship was decelerating now, approaching what looked like a docking facility built into the side of a tower that stretched beyond visual range in both directions. The dock itself was a work of art, delicate spires and sweeping curves that somehow managed to look both elegant and threatening. And everywhere, moving with that characteristic fluid grace, were Dark Eldar. Hundreds of them. Thousands. More than I'd ever imagined could exist in one place. They moved through the docking facility like schools of predatory fish, each one beautiful and terrible, and utterly alien despite their humanoid appearance. I could see warriors in spiked armor, artist torturers carrying arrays of impossible instruments, slave masters leading chains of prisoners from dozens of species. The Port of Lost Souls, Serene explained as our ship settled into its berth with mechanical precision. Where the harvest of 1,000 worlds is brought to market, your fellow survivors will be sorted and distributed according to their potential entertainment value. Through the deck plating, I could hear the sounds of other prisoners being moved. Human voices raised in terror and despair, the crack of whips, the musical laughter of our captors enjoying their work. Somewhere among those voices were the remnants of my regiment, good soldiers who'd followed orders and done their duty and deserved better than this. And me? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Serene's smile revealed those filed teeth. You, my dear little Monkey, are special. You're not going to the slave markets or the fighting pits or the pleasure houses. No, you've been selected for something much more intimate. She stood and moved toward the chamber's exit, pausing at the threshold to deliver her final revelation. You're going to be my personal project, a long-term study of the limits of human endurance. I estimate it will take several centuries to fully explore your psychological landscape, to map every fear and desire and weakness that makes you uniquely yourself. Centuries. The word hit me like a physical blow. Not years or decades, but centuries of systematic torture designed to preserve my sanity just long enough to ensure that I remained aware of every moment of suffering. The beauty of our city, Serene continued, is that time moves differently here. In Commorragh, death is a privilege that must be earned through proper appreciation of our arts. You'll live as long as we find you amusing, and I have a feeling you'll be very amusing indeed. The chamber's exit dilated open like an organic sphincter, revealing a corridor that stretched away into darkness. But it wasn't empty darkness. I could see shapes moving in the shadows, hear whispers, in languages that made my teeth ache just to perceive them. Welcome to Commorragh, little Monkey, Serene said, as her racks entered to collect me. Welcome to the city where screams are music and suffering is the highest form of art. As they dragged me from the chamber, I caught one last glimpse of the transformed remnants of my shipmates. They were being loaded onto hover platforms by creatures that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of a dozen different species. Lieutenant Corrin's multiple eyes were weeping tears of blood, and his harmonized voices were singing something that sounded almost like a hymn to despair, a song for the damned. The last thing I heard as they pulled me into the corridor was the sound of Serene's laughter echoing off the organic walls, promising delights and torments beyond imagination. The hunt was over. The feast was about to begin. The corridors of Commorragh were living things. I realized this as Serene's racks dragged me deeper into the dark city's bowels, my bare feet sliding across surfaces that felt more like flesh than metal or stone. The walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat I'd ever heard. Too fast for human, too slow for the frantic flutter of small prey animals. Something in between, something wrong. Bioluminescent veins ran along the ceiling like exposed nerves, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. And everywhere, carved into the organic architecture, or growing from it like tumors, were faces. Human faces, Eldar faces, visages belonging to a species I couldn't identify. All of them were screaming. The screaming halls of Sub-District Malice, one of the racks explained in its grinding metal voice, noticing my horrified fascination. The walls are grown from liquefied prisoners, their consciousness preserved in the living stone. They've been screaming for millennia, but they still remember enough of what they were to understand their fate. I tried not to listen too closely to the sounds emanating from the walls, but it was impossible to block them out entirely. Whispered pleas for mercy, fragments of prayers in languages both familiar and alien, names called out to loved ones who would never answer. The entire structure was a symphony of despair, and we were walking through its beating heart. Other prisoners moved through these corridors in chains, humans mostly, but I could see representatives of other species as well. Tau warriors with their grey skin now mottled with bruises and burn marks, orc captives that had been surgically diminished until they were small enough to handle safely. Even a few creatures that might have been space marines, though they'd been so extensively modified that it was hard to be certain. All of them bore the same expression of blank, absolute terror. Not the immediate fear of physical danger, but the deeper horror that comes from understanding that you are utterly powerless in the hands of creatures who view your suffering as entertainment. We passed through a district where the architecture changed from organic curves to jagged crystalline formations that hummed with barely contained energy. Here, the screams were different, sharper, more focused, as if pain was being refined and concentrated into its purest possible form. The crystal gardens, the second rack noted with something that might have been professional appreciation, where raw agony is crystallized and stored for later use. Very efficient. Nothing goes to waste in Commorragh. Through the transparent crystal walls, I could see figures trapped inside the formations, prisoners suspended in moments of perfect torment, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute anguish. But their eyes were still moving, still aware, still processing the reality of their situation with horrifying clarity. We entered a vast chamber that seemed to stretch upward beyond visual range. The space was filled with cages, thousands of them, suspended from chains that disappeared into the darkness above. Each cage was a work of art in its own right, crafted from materials that looked like polished bone and gleaming metal. But the artistry was in the details. The way the bars were positioned to prevent comfortable rest, the spikes that made any movement potentially injurious, the restraints that held occupants in positions designed to maximize long-term discomfort. The collection vaults, Serene's voice echoed from speakers embedded in the chamber's walls, where we store our most promising subjects while deciding their ultimate fate. You'll have neighbors, little monkey, survivors from across the galaxy, each with their own unique story of loss and despair. My cage was near the bottom of the chamber, suspended perhaps 50 feet above a floor I couldn't see in the darkness. The racks loaded me into it with practiced efficiency, checking the locks and restraints with the care of professionals who took pride in their work. The cage was just large enough for me to lie down if I curled into a fetal position, but too small to stand upright or stretch out fully. Feeding will occur at irregular intervals, one of the racks informed me, as it secured the final restraint. Random timing prevents prisoners from developing expectations or routines. Hope is the enemy of proper despair cultivation. The second rack added a personal touch, a small device that it attached to the cage's ceiling. The object looked like a metallic spider with too many legs, and when it activated, it began projecting holographic images into the air around me. Images of home. I saw Cadia as I remembered it from my youth. The purple sky at sunset, the fortress cities rising like mountains from the plains, the endless columns of soldiers marching to war with parade ground precision. I saw the faces of comrades I'd served with over the years, men and women who'd died heroically in service to the Emperor. I saw the simple pleasures of garrison life, shared meals, games of regicide, and letters from families I'd helped protect. All of it was real. All of it was gone. And all of it was being shown to me by creatures who understood exactly how much it would hurt to see these things while trapped in a cage in the heart of an alien nightmare city. Psychological conditioning, the first rack explained, its voice taking on the tone of a teacher providing instruction. Hope must be carefully maintained and then systematically destroyed. Simple physical torture becomes boring after a few decades, but the slow erosion of everything that makes existence meaningful, that provides entertainment for centuries. They left me alone after that, suspended in my cage of barbs, while the holographic projector continued its merciless display of everything I'd lost. Around me, the other cages swayed gently on their chains, and I could hear their occupants' whispered conversations in a dozen languages, prayers to gods both familiar and alien, the soft sounds of weeping that spoke of spirits broken beyond repair. "New meat," said a voice from the cage nearest to mine. The speaker was human, or had been once. Now he bore the modifications typical of the Dark Eldar's improvements. Additional eyes grafted onto his forehead, arms that had been replaced with mechanical appendages ending in razor-sharp claws. But his voice still carried the distinctive accent of Valhalla. "Colonel Marcus Thorn, 15th Valhallan Ice Warriors," he continued, his multiple eyes focusing on me with disturbing intensity. "Been here for... The Emperor's blood must be 40 years old now. Lost count after the first decade. 40 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. This man had been trapped in Commorragh since before I'd even joined the Imperial Guard. He'd watched the Imperium age and changed through the limited news that filtered down to whatever hellhole world I'd been fighting on, while he'd remained here, preserved in a state of perpetual suffering for the amusement of alien monsters. "What's your name, son?" Thorn asked, and despite everything that had been done to him, there was still authority in his voice. Still, the bearing of a man who'd been accustomed to command. "Trooper Vex Thane, 47th Cadian," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We were on patrol in the Hadrian system when they took us." "Cadia," Thorn mused, his mechanical claws clicking against the bars of his cage. "Haven't heard that name in years. How is the fortress world faring?" I almost told him the truth, that Cadia had fallen during the 13th Black Crusade, that the fortress world was nothing but asteroid fields and bitter memories now. But looking at his face, at the way hope flickered in those grafted eyes when he spoke of his homeworld, I couldn't do it. "Still standing," I lied, still defiant. The lie seemed to give him strength, and he straightened slightly in his cramped cage. "Good. That's good. The fortress worlds are the spine of the Imperium's defense. As long as they stand, there's hope. Hope." The word seemed obscene in this place, surrounded by centuries' worth of accumulated suffering. But I could see why the Dark Eldar were so careful to preserve it in their prisoners. Hope was what made the torture meaningful. Without it, death would be just another biological function. "They'll break you, son," Thorn said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades worth of bitter experience. "Not today, probably not next week, but eventually they'll find the combination of physical and psychological pressures that will crack you open like an egg. The only question is whether you can hold on to enough of yourself to still be human when it happens." Around us, the other cages continued their gentle swaying motion, and I began to make out more details about my fellow prisoners. There was a woman in an Imperial Navy uniform whose skin had been replaced with translucent crystal, allowing me to see her organs pulsing beneath the surface. An orc whose body had been surgically reduced to the size of a human child, but whose mind remained intact, creating a creature of permanent, impotent rage. Something that might have been an Astartes. though so extensively modified that it was impossible to identify its original chapter. "The worst part," said another voice from somewhere above us, "isn't what they do to your body. Bodies can be repaired, replaced, or modified beyond recognition. The worst part is what they do to your memories." The speaker was suspended in a cage directly above mine, a thin, elderly man whose eyes had been replaced with mechanical devices that whirred and clicked as they tracked movement. Professor Hadrian Vex, formerly of the Scholar Progenium on Ophelia 7. They've been editing my recollections for the past 60 years. Sometimes I remember things that never happened. Sometimes I forget things that were fundamental to who I am. He leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow, his mechanical eyes focusing on me with disturbing intensity. "Tell me, young trooper, do you remember your mother's name?" The question hit me like a slap. Of course I remembered. She'd been Helena Thane, a factory worker in one of Cadia's industrial cities. She'd died when I was 12, killed in an orc raid that had penetrated the fortress world's outer defenses. I could still see her face, still hear her voice singing the old battle hymns as she worked. But as I tried to speak her name, doubt crept in. Had her name really been Helena? Or was that someone else? Some composite memory created by decades of warfare and trauma? The harder I tried to focus on her face, the more it seemed to shift and change, like looking at a reflection in disturbed water. "That's how it starts," Professor Vex said sadly. "First, you doubt the small things, the details that seem unimportant. Then the doubt spreads, like an infection eating away at everything you thought you knew about yourself. In the end, you're not sure what's real and what's been implanted, what's memory and what's carefully constructed fiction." The holographic projector continued its merciless display, showing me scenes from a life that might or might not have been mine. I watched myself as a child playing in the streets of Akkadian fortress city. But now I couldn't be sure if that child had really been me, or if these were someone else's memories grafted onto my consciousness. The beautiful thing about memory modification, Serene's voice echoed through the chamber, though I couldn't see her anywhere, is that it's self-reinforcing. The more you doubt your recollections, the more unreliable they become. Eventually, you reach a point where you're not even sure if the doubt itself is real. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on something concrete, something I could be certain of was true. My lasgun serial number is L44577791 Delta. I'd carried that weapon for 8 years, cleaned it thousands of times, and memorized every component and specification. That was real. That was something they couldn't take away from me. Except when I tried to picture the weapon, I couldn't remember if the serial number had been etched into the barrel or stamped into the receiver. Was it Delta or Gamma? Had I really carried it for 8 years, or was that someone else's service record? 23 hours, said a new voice from one of the upper cages. That's how long it took them to make me forget my own name. Not erase it entirely, that would be too simple. They just made me doubt whether it had ever really belonged to me. The chamber filled with the sound of quiet laughter, dozens of prisoners who had reached the point where their own suffering had become genuinely amusing to them. It wasn't the hysterical laughter of broken minds, but something worse. The laughter of people who had learned to find entertainment in their own destruction. I opened my eyes and stared at the holographic projector, watching scenes from a life that might have been mine play out in perfect detail. But now every image carried the weight of uncertainty, every memory contaminated with doubt. The Dark Eldar hadn't just imprisoned my body, they were systematically dismantling my soul, one cherished recollection at a time. And the worst part was that I was starting to help them do it. Time in the collection vaults was measured not in hours or days, but in the intervals between entertainments. The Dark Eldar came for us irregularly, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, always with the theatrical flair that characterized everything they did. Today, they wanted me. The racks who collected me from my cage moved with their characteristic mechanical precision, but there was something different about them this time, an anticipation that seemed to thrum through their modified forms like electricity through copper wire. They weren't just performing a routine collection, they were excited about something. "Special performance tonight," one of them informed me, as they secured the neural shackles around my wrists and ankles. The devices looked deceptively simple, thin bands of what appeared to be polished silver, but I could feel them interfacing with my nervous system, mapping every nerve pathway with surgical precision. "Arena combat," the second rack added, its grinding voice carrying a note of professional interest. "You'll be given weapons and armor, pitted against other prisoners for the entertainment of the hierarchs. Survive long enough to provide adequate amusement, and you earn another day of life." They led me through corridors I hadn't seen before, passages that curved and twisted through dimensions that hurt to contemplate directly. The architecture here was even more organic than in the collection vaults. Walls that pulsed with visible heartbeats, floors that yielded slightly underfoot like walking on exposed muscle tissue, a ceiling that dripped with fluids I didn't want to identify. We passed through districts dedicated to different aspects of the Dark Eldar's culture of refined cruelty. The Flensing Quarter, where live prisoners were systematically skinned by artist torturers who took decades to complete their work. The Screaming Gardens, where the air itself had been weaponized to cause auditory hallucinations and synesthetic nightmares. The Mirror Maze, where reflective surfaces showed not your current appearance, but what you would look like after years of systematic torture. Each district was populated by Dark Eldar, who moved through their environment with the easy confidence of apex predators in their natural habitat. They wore their cruelty like fine clothing, elegant, refined, displayed with artistic pride. Some rode on bizarre mounts that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of a dozen different creatures. Others floated on platforms that seemed to defy gravity, their forms draped in garments made from what I desperately hoped was synthetic material. But what struck me most was how normal it all seemed to them. This wasn't aberrant behavior or psychopathic deviation from their species' norm. This was their civilization, as natural and unremarkable to them as imperial architecture was to me. The arena entrance was a work of art that took my breath away despite everything I'd already seen. Vast doors that rose perhaps 100 feet high, carved from what looked like a single piece of jade green stone. But as we approached, I realized the stone wasn't carved at all. It was grown. The decorative elements were actually prisoners who had been petrified while still alive, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal terror. "The Gateway of Final Sorrows," one of the racks explained with something approaching reverence. "Built from the crystallized screams of 10,000 souls. Each face you see was once a living being who contributed their final moments of despair to this monument." The doors opened as we approached, revealing an amphitheater that defied every law of physics and sanity. The arena floor was far below us, perhaps 1,000 feet down, but the structure seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I could see seating areas that were simultaneously above and below us, spectator boxes that occupied the same space as the combat floor, and viewing galleries that curved through angles that shouldn't exist. And it was full. Thousands of Dark Eldar filled the impossible seating arrangements, their pale forms creating a sea of anticipatory cruelty that stretched beyond visual range. They wore their finest clothes for this occasion, garments that looked like they'd been woven from shadow and pain, jewelry that incorporated living organisms into their decorative schemes, masks that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "The Crimson Colosseum," said a new voice, and I turned to see a figure approaching that made even the racks step back in apparent deference. This was clearly a person of importance in Dark Eldar society, taller than the others, more elaborately dressed, moving with the kind of unconscious authority that comes from millennia of absolute power. "I am Archon Vectathara, the Soul Drinker," the figure said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies both above and below human hearing. "And you, little Monkey, are tonight's entertainment." The Archon was a creature of terrible beauty, ancient beyond measure, with features that might have been carved by master sculptors if those sculptors had been trying to capture the perfect synthesis of elegance and cruelty. Its armor was a work of art that incorporated living tissue into its design, creating patterns that shifted and moved as I watched. But it was the eyes that truly marked it as something beyond human understanding. Pools of absolute darkness that seemed to contain the accumulated suffering of civilizations. "You've been selected for a special honor," Vectathara continued, gesturing toward the arena floor far below. "Combat against some of our most prized specimens. The betting pools are quite extensive, and most wagered that you would last less than 5 minutes. I have more confidence in your durability." As if summoned by invisible signals, other prisoners began arriving at the arena's staging area. I recognized some of them from the collection vaults, fellow survivors from the Righteous Vengeance, who bore the modifications typical of extended captivity in Commorragh. But there were others I'd never seen before, creatures from across the galaxy who had been brought here for the entertainment of monsters. There was a space marine or something that had been a space marine before the Dark Eldar's attentions. His power armor had been replaced with organic equivalents that pulsed and writhed with every movement. Extra arms had been grafted onto his torso, each ending in weapons that looked like they'd been grown rather than manufactured. But his face still held traces of the noble bearing that marked the Emperor's finest warriors, though it was overlaid with the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had endured decades of systematic torture. "Brother Matthias of the Crimson Fists," he said when he noticed my attention. His voice was a mechanical rasp, processed through vocal cords that had been replaced with synthetic alternatives. "Chapter destroyed at Rin's world. Captured during the evacuation of civilian populations. Rin's world." I remembered that name from intelligence briefings, a fortress world that had fallen to an orc invasion several decades ago. This Marine had been fighting the Dark Eldars games for longer than I'd been alive. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 47 years, 3 months, 16 days, Matthias replied with the precision that marked all Astartes. "They keep careful records. Time is another instrument in their orchestra of suffering." Near him stood a figure that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. Multiple heads had been grafted onto a single torso, each bearing a different expression of madness or despair. When it spoke, all the heads moved in unison, creating a disturbing chorus effect. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen," the thing said, its multiple voices harmonizing in ways that made my teeth ache. "Imperial Navy, formerly of the battlecruiser Emperor's Wrath. They decided I needed perspective on command decisions. Now I get to experience every choice from multiple viewpoints simultaneously. The horror of it hit me immediately. Command officers were trained to make life and death decisions affecting thousands of people. To force someone to experience every consequence from multiple perspectives simultaneously would create a feedback loop of guilt and second-guessing that would drive any rational mind to madness. Other prisoners continued to arrive. A Tau fire warrior whose armor had been fused directly to his flesh. An orc nob who had been surgically reduced to human size, but retained all his species' natural aggression. something that might have been an Eldar ranger, though it was hard to be certain after the extensive modifications. Tonight's entertainment, Archon Vectorthara announced, its voice carrying clearly despite the vast distances involved, will be a demonstration of adaptive evolution. Each contestant has been enhanced to provide maximum entertainment value. Weapons will be provided, but victory conditions are simple. Survive longer than your opponents. The arena floor began to rise toward us, revealing itself to be a massive platform that could be reconfigured according to the needs of each performance. Tonight's setting appeared to be a maze of crystalline structures that refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Hidden within the maze, I could see weapon alcoves and equipment stations, tools of violence provided by hosts who understood that the best entertainment came from giving prey just enough hope to make their eventual defeat meaningful. Contestants will enter from different points, Vecthara continued. Victory is achieved by being the last survivor. However, simply hiding and avoiding combat will result in encouragement from our automated systems. Cowardice provides poor entertainment. As if to demonstrate this point, the arena floor suddenly erupted with spikes in a random pattern. The spikes were beautiful, crystalline formations that would have looked at home in a cathedral, but their purpose was unmistakably lethal. Any prisoner who tried to simply wait out their opponents would find themselves impaled on gorgeous works of art. Weapons, one of the racks announced, leading us toward an armory that had been built into the staging area. The selection was extensive, blades of every description, projectile weapons that looked like they'd been grown rather than manufactured, energy weapons that hummed with barely contained power. But everything was subtly wrong, designed not just to kill, but to do so in ways that would provide maximum spectacle. I selected a weapon that looked almost familiar, something like a laser gun, but with organic components that pulsed with their own internal rhythms. The grip felt warm and slightly damp, as if it were made from living tissue. When I checked its power cell, the display showed symbols I couldn't read, but the weapon hummed with readiness. Brother Matthias chose a blade that seemed to be forged from crystallized pain, a weapon that screamed softly when he hefted it, as if the metal itself were in agony. The multi-headed thing that had been Lieutenant Commander Chen selected a weapon that looked like it had been designed by committee, multiple barrels, redundant trigger mechanisms, enough firepower to level a building, but configured in ways that would make accurate shooting nearly impossible. Final preparations, Vectorthara announced, as the arena platform reached our level. Remember, little playthings, you are not just fighting for your lives. You are fighting for the entertainment of beings whose understanding of art encompasses depths of experience your primitive minds cannot fathom. Die well, and your suffering will be remembered. Die poorly, and you'll be resurrected to try again. Resurrected. The word sent ice through my veins, because I knew it wasn't hyperbole. The Dark Eldar had technologies that could restore life to the recently dead, bringing back fallen gladiators to fight again and again, until they either provided adequate entertainment or their minds shattered completely under the strain of repeated death and resurrection. Transport to starting positions, the racks commanded, herding us toward individual lift platforms that would carry us to different entry points in the maze. As my platform began to descend toward the arena floor, I caught one last glimpse of the spectator areas. They were full. Thousands of Dark Eldar had come to watch us tear each other apart for their amusement, and their anticipation was palpable. They leaned forward in their seats like predators preparing to feed, their pale faces gleaming with excitement at the prospect of witnessing fresh varieties of suffering. My platform settled onto the arena floor in a section of the maze that seemed designed to disorient and confuse. Crystalline walls rose around me, their surfaces reflecting distorted images that might have been other parts of the maze or might have been complete fabrications. The floor beneath my feet felt solid enough, but it seemed to shift slightly with each step, as if the entire structure were alive and responding to my presence. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of other contestants being deposited at their starting positions. Brother Matthias's mechanical voice rose in what might have been a battle prayer, the multiple voices of Lieutenant Commander Chen arguing with themselves about tactical approaches, the frustrated roars of the diminished orc as it tried to process its situation. "Let the games begin." Vector Thara's voice echoed through the arena, carrying easily over the ambient noise of thousands of excited spectators. The maze came alive around us. Walls began moving, reconfiguring themselves according to some predetermined pattern that would force us into contact with each other. Hidden speakers began playing sounds designed to mask the approach of enemies. Whispers, screams, the sound of weapons being charged and discharged. I pressed myself against the nearest wall and tried to orient myself, but the crystalline surface showed only fragmented reflections that could have been anything. In the shifting light, cast by bioluminescent strips overhead, every shadow seemed to conceal potential threats. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from somewhere deeper in the maze, carrying a note of absolute terror that spoke of sudden, violent death. One of the contestants had found another, and the entertainment had begun. The crowd roared its approval, and I realized that I was no longer a prisoner waiting for death. I was a performer in a show where the only way to survive was to become the monster the audience wanted to see. The hunt had become mutual. In this crystalline labyrinth, we were all predators and prey simultaneously, and somewhere in the shifting passages around me, my fellow survivors were learning the same terrible lesson. I survived the arena, not through skill or courage or any of the martial virtues that the Imperial Guard had tried to instill in me over 17 years of service. I survived through cowardice, cunning, and the kind of desperate pragmatism that only emerges when death is the alternative to dishonor. The maze had been designed to force confrontation, but it was still a maze. While Brother Matthias and the others fought their savage battles in the central corridors, I found the spaces between spaces, maintenance shafts, and ventilation passages that the arena's designers had included for purely functional purposes. I spent most of the combat crouched in a crawlway barely wide enough for my shoulders, listening to the sounds of my fellow prisoners tearing each other apart for the entertainment of monsters. Brother Matthias lasted 47 minutes. I heard his final battle, a running fight with the modified orc that ended when they both triggered one of the arena's trap systems simultaneously. The crowd's roar when they died together was so loud it made the crystalline walls vibrate. Lieutenant Commander Chen's multiple personalities argued with each other right up until the end, her various heads debating tactical options, even as the Tau Fire Warriors' fused weapons systems burned through her position. She lasted 33 minutes. In the end, I won by default, the last survivor in a maze full of corpses, emerging from my hiding place only when Archon Vector Thara's voice echoed through the arena, announcing the end of combat. The crowd's reaction to my victory was mixed. Some seemed pleased by the novelty of a survivor who had won through stealth rather than violence. Others appeared disappointed by the lack of spectacular bloodshed. But I was alive, which was more than could be said for the other contestants. My reward for this victory was a new form of torment. "Congratulations, little Mon Kai," Serene Blood Whisper said, as her racks escorted me from the arena. "You've shown remarkable survival instincts. Cowardly, certainly, but effective. The hierarchs were quite amused by your creative interpretation of the combat parameters. We were moving through a different section of Commorragh now, one where the architecture was even more overtly organic than what I'd seen before. The walls weren't just grown, they were actively growing, extending new passages and chambers in response to some alien intelligence that I couldn't comprehend. And everywhere, embedded in the living structure like decorative elements, were faces, not just human faces, but representatives of every species the Dark Eldar had encountered in their millennia of raiding. The homunculi covens, Serene explained, noticing my horrified fascination, where the true artists of our race perfect their understanding of flesh and spirit. You've earned an audience with one of the greatest masters of the craft. Homunculi. I'd heard the term before, in whispered briefings about Dark Eldar society. Flesh sculptors and pain artists who treated living beings like raw material for their grotesque masterpieces. They were supposed to be ancient beyond measure, creatures who had transcended the normal limitations of their species through centuries of experimentation on themselves and others. We entered a chamber that defied rational description. It was part laboratory, part art studio, part charnel house. Surgical instruments that looked like they'd been grown rather than forged, hung from the ceiling in precise arrays. Vats of bubbling liquid contained specimens in various stages of modification, some recognizably human or near human, others transformed into shapes that had no names in any language I knew. And everywhere, scattered throughout the chamber like discarded notes, were the results of failed experiments. Creatures that writhed and whispered in corners, things that had once been sentient beings, but were now living testaments to the plasticity of flesh when subjected to sufficiently advanced torture techniques. Master Urian Rakarth, Serene announced, her voice carrying the respectful tone of a student addressing a revered teacher. I present the arena survivor for your consideration. The figure that emerged from the shadows at the chamber's far end was a nightmare-given form. At first glance, it appeared roughly humanoid, tall, slender, moving with the characteristic grace of all Dark Eldar. But the details were wrong, in ways that made my sanity recoil. Its skin was translucent, revealing the network of veins and organs beneath in disturbing detail. Extra arms had been grafted onto its torso, each ending in hands that bore too many fingers, or fingers that ended in surgical instruments. Its face was a work of art that incorporated living tissue into its design, eyes that weren't all the same color or shape, a mouth that smiled with teeth borrowed from a dozen different species. Ah, it said, its voice a harmonious chorus of tones that suggested multiple vocal cords had been installed in series. The survivor. How delightfully intact. Urian Rakarth circled me like a sculptor examining a block of marble, its multiple hands making notes on instruments I couldn't identify. Each step it took was perfectly silent, and I had the disturbing impression that its feet weren't touching the ground at all. 17 years of warfare, it mused, reading from a data slate held in one of its extra hands. Extensive scarring consistent with projectile weapons, edged weapons, and energy discharge. Muscle development is appropriate for extended physical stress. Neurological damage is minimal, despite extended exposure to combat trauma. It paused in front of me, its mismatched eyes focusing with predatory intensity. But what interests me most is the psychological profile. You've survived situations that would break most minds, adapted to circumstances that should have been fatal. There's something resilient about your mental architecture. One of its surgical hands reached out and traced the scar on my left arm, a souvenir from the siege of Mordak's Prime, where an orc chopper had nearly severed the limb entirely. The touch was gentle, almost caressing, but I could feel something invasive about it, as if the creature were reading the history written in my flesh. Tell me about pain, Urian said, its multiple voices creating harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. Not the simple physical sensation. Any amateur can produce that. No, I want to understand your relationship with suffering. How do you process it? How do you move beyond it? What mechanisms does your mind use to compartmentalize trauma and continue functioning? I didn't answer immediately, partly because I wasn't sure how to articulate something that had always been instinctive, but mostly because I was trying to process the horror of my surroundings. The chamber was filled with things that had once been sentient beings, but were now living art installations, sculptures of flesh and bone, arranged in poses that suggested eternal agony. I don't think about it, I finally managed. The pain, I mean. You push through it. Focus on the mission, on the objective. Deal with the consequences later. Fascinating, Urian mused, making notes on its data slate with surgical precision. Compartmentalization as a survival mechanism. Conscious suppression of trauma response in service of immediate tactical requirements. But what happens to the suppressed material? It doesn't simply disappear. It must be stored somewhere in your psyche. Its multiple hands began moving across my body, not touching, but somehow sensing things that normal examination couldn't reveal. I could feel its attention, like a physical weight, probing for weaknesses and vulnerabilities that I didn't even know I possessed. The beautiful thing about psychological trauma, Urian continued, is that it's cumulative. Each suppressed experience adds to the total load, creating stress fractures in the mental architecture. Eventually, the accumulated weight becomes too much to bear, and the entire structure collapses catastrophically. It gestured toward one of the chamber's occupied vats, where something that might once have been human floated in amber-colored fluid. The creature's body was intact, but its face bore an expression of absolute madness. Eyes rolled back to show only whites, mouth stretched in a silent scream that had apparently been going on for years. That specimen tried to process 17 years of accumulated combat trauma all at once, Urian explained with clinical detachment. The result was artistically satisfying, but not particularly instructive. Simple mental collapse provides limited entertainment value. It turned back to me, its mismatched eyes gleaming with interest. But you're different. Your compartmentalization mechanisms are more sophisticated, more durable. I could spend decades carefully dismantling them, exploring each suppressed memory in exquisite detail. The accumulated suffering of an entire military career, experienced all at once in perfect clarity. The prospect was more terrifying than anything physical they could do to me. I'd spent years building walls in my mind, creating barriers between my conscious self and the things I'd seen and done in service to the Emperor. The thought of having those walls torn down, of being forced to experience every moment of horror and loss simultaneously. However, Urian continued, apparently noting my reaction with professional satisfaction, such a project would require extensive preparation. Your psychological landscape needs to be properly mapped before we can begin the serious work of demolition. It moved to a workstation where dozens of instruments were arranged with surgical precision. Each tool was a work of art in its own right. Beautiful, terrible, designed for purposes that I didn't want to imagine. We'll start with something simple, Urian said, selecting a device that looked like a needle made from crystallized starlight. A basic neural probe to establish baseline responses. This will hurt considerably, but the pain serves a functional purpose. It makes the brain more receptive to external influence. The needle slid into my skull just behind my left ear with surgical precision. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Not just physical agony, but something deeper. something that seemed to strike directly at the core of my consciousness. I could feel the device interfacing with my nervous system, mapping neural pathways with the care of an artist preparing a canvas. Excellent responsiveness, Urian noted, watching readouts on instruments I couldn't see. Strong pain tolerance, but not abnormally high. Neurological architecture consistent with extended combat exposure. Now let's see what happens when we stimulate specific memory centers. The world exploded into fragments of recalled horror. I was back on Mordak's Prime, watching Corporal Hayes die as an orc chopper opened his skull like a flower. Back on Genna 7, crawling through tunnels filled with the stench of rotting flesh and orc spores. Back on Hadron's world, standing in a field of corpses that had once been my regiment, wondering why I'd survived when better soldiers had died. But this wasn't just memory. It was perfect recall, experienced with the full emotional impact of the original events. Every moment of fear, every second of despair, every instant of survivor's guilt cascaded through my consciousness with devastating clarity. Beautiful, Urian whispered, its multiple voices creating harmonies of appreciation. Look at the neural cascade patterns, the way traumatic memories reinforce each other, creating feedback loops of escalating psychological damage. Truly exquisite craftsmanship. Through the haze of recalled agony, I could see other figures moving around the chamber. More homunculi, drawn by the novelty of my neural responses. They gathered around the monitoring equipment, like art critics examining a masterpiece, their modified forms creating a circle of grotesque appreciation. Note the resilience factors, one of them observed, its voice carrying the authority of centuries. Even under full memory cascade, the subject maintains basic cognitive function. The compartmentalization mechanisms are fighting to reassert themselves. Indeed, Urian agreed, adjusting something on the neural probe that sent fresh waves of agony through my skull. But watch what happens when we prevent that compartmentalization from occurring. The pain became something beyond human language to describe. Not just physical agony or psychological trauma, but a combination of both that seemed to attack the very concept of individual consciousness. I could feel my sense of self fragmenting, breaking apart into component memories and experiences that no longer belonged to a coherent whole. Perfect, Urian said, with the satisfaction of an artist achieving exactly the effect they'd envisioned. Complete personality dissolution, while maintaining basic awareness. The subject experiences total psychological destruction, while remaining conscious enough to understand what's happening to them. Through the nightmare of fragmenting consciousness, I heard Serene's voice from what seemed like an impossible distance. How long can you maintain this state? Indefinitely, Urian replied, its multiple voices harmonizing with pleasure. The beautiful thing about this technique is that it's completely sustainable. The subject will remain conscious and aware while experiencing perpetual psychological dissolution. They'll spend eternity dying, without ever quite achieving the release of actual death. The chamber began to fade around the edges, not because I was losing consciousness, but because my ability to process sensory input was being systematically dismantled. I could still see, still hear, feel, but none of these sensations belonged to a coherent self that could interpret them meaningfully. And somewhere in the dissolving fragments of what had once been my identity, I realized that this was just the beginning. I was no longer Vex Thane of the 47th Cadian Regiment. I was raw material for an artist whose medium was suffering itself. The masterpiece was about to begin. Consciousness returned like surfacing from deep water into a world where alien minds had rewritten reality with a taste for sophisticated cruelty. I was no longer in Urian Rakarth's laboratory. Instead, I found myself in what appeared to be a forest, if forests could be built from crystallized screams and grown in the spaces between dimensions. The trees were tall, elegant structures that might have been beautiful if they hadn't been covered in faces. Human faces, Eldar faces, visages belonging to species I couldn't identify, all of them screaming silently in expressions of perfect agony. The ground beneath my feet felt soft and yielding, like walking on carpet made from something that had once been alive. When I looked down, I realized that's exactly what it was. A lawn cultivated from the flayed skin of countless prisoners, each piece still retaining enough nervous tissue to respond to pressure with subtle movements that made my stomach lurch. Other figures moved between the screaming trees, fellow prisoners from Commorragh's collection vaults, all of us deposited here for some new form of entertainment. I recognized some faces from the arena combat, though they looked different now. Not physically changed exactly, but marked by a kind of spiritual exhaustion that spoke of souls pushed beyond their normal limits. "Welcome to the labyrinth of echoes," said a familiar voice. Colonel Thorne approached through the grotesque forest, his modifications more extensive than I'd realized. His mechanical limbs moved with predatory grace that seemed fundamentally wrong on a human form, and his grafted eyes tracked movement with inhuman precision. How long was I began, then realized I wasn't sure how to finish the question. Time seemed to move differently here, measured not in hours or days, but in the intervals between suffering. "Hard to say," Thorne replied, his multiple eyes focusing on me with disturbing intensity. "Could have been days, could have been weeks. The homunculi like to edit our memories of their sessions. Makes it harder to build up psychological defenses." Around us, the forest began to change. The screaming trees shifted position, like living things responding to some unheard signal, and new paths opened between them, while others closed. The landscape was actively reshaping itself, creating new configurations for whatever game the Dark Eldar had planned. "It's starting," said another voice. A woman in a torn Imperial Navy uniform approached, half her face covered by modifications that looked like they'd been grown rather than surgically attached, creating asymmetric features disturbing to look at directly. "Commander Voss," she introduced herself, "or what's left of me. Been here long enough to see this particular entertainment before. They call it the Hunt Within. Prisoners released into a labyrinth while Wyches track us for sport." Wyches, I'd heard the term before, in intelligence briefings about Dark Eldar society. Combat cultists who treated violence as artistic expression, gladiators who found religious ecstasy in inflicting and receiving pain. They were supposed to be incredibly fast, impossibly graceful, and utterly without mercy. "The labyrinth changes constantly," Voss continued, gesturing toward the shifting forest. "New paths, new obstacles, new opportunities for artistic murder. The witches are given weapons and turned loose to hunt us down one by one. Last survivor gets to live until the next entertainment." "How many times have you survived this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Her smile revealed teeth that had been filed to points in imitation of our captors. 7 times. Each time I learn a little more about how they think, how they move, how they kill. Each time I become a little less human and a little more like them. The implications hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about physical modifications. She was describing a transformation of consciousness, a gradual erosion of human identity through repeated exposure to alien modes of thought. "The key to survival," Thorne added, his mechanical limbs clicking, "is to stop thinking like prey and start thinking like a predator. The witches respect cunning and appreciate creativity in their opponents. Give them a good hunt, and they might let you live long enough to become worthy prey. In the distance, I could hear sounds that confirmed my worst fears. Musical laughter echoing through the crystalline forest, the whisper of feet moving across the skin carpet with predatory silence. Our hunters were already in the labyrinth, and the game had begun. "Split up," Voss advised, her modified features showing traces of the tactical thinking that had once made her an effective naval officer. "They enjoy the chase more than the quick kill. Make them work for it, and you might buy enough time to find better hiding places." She disappeared between the screaming trees with fluid grace that reminded me uncomfortably of our captors. Thorn followed moments later, his mechanical limbs allowing him to move through the forest with superhuman speed and silence. I was alone in a forest of crystallized suffering, being hunted by creatures that treated murder as performance art. The first scream came from somewhere deeper in the labyrinth, a sound of pure terror that spoke of sudden, violent death. One of the prisoners had encountered their hunters, and the entertainment had begun. The scream was followed by musical laughter that seemed to come from all directions at once, creating an acoustic landscape of predatory joy. I pressed myself against the nearest tree, trying to use its bulk for concealment, while my mind raced through survival options. The trunk felt warm and slightly yielding, like pressing against living tissue, and I could see that the screaming faces embedded in its surface were tracking my movement with their eyes. A new sound reached me, soft footsteps moving across the skin carpet with careful precision. The footsteps were coming closer, accompanied by a low humming that might have been someone singing to themselves. I moved as carefully as I could, trying to put distance between myself and the approaching sounds while avoiding open areas where I'd be visible from multiple directions. But the labyrinth was working against me. Paths that had been open moments before were now blocked by new growths of crystalline vegetation, while areas that had been impassable were suddenly accessible. The humming grew closer, and now I could make out words in a language I didn't recognize. The voice was unmistakably female, melodic and cultured, singing what might have been a hunting song in tones that made my teeth ache just to hear them. I caught a glimpse of her between the trees, tall, impossibly slender, moving through the forest with the fluid grace that characterized all Dark Eldar. But where Serene and the others had been elegant predators, this creature was something more primal. Her armor was minimal, designed to showcase rather than protect, and her weapons were extensions of her body rather than separate tools. A Witcher member of the combat cults that treated violence as a religious experience. She paused in a clearing, perhaps 50 yards from my position, her head tilted as if listening to sounds that existed below the threshold of human perception. When she moved again, it was with sudden, explosive speed. There one moment, gone next, appearing in a completely different location without seeming to have crossed the intervening space. Another scream echoed through the labyrinth, closer this time. The witches were systematically working their way through the prisoner population, each kill accompanied by sounds of artistic appreciation that spoke of murders being performed with aesthetic consideration. I needed to move, but every direction seemed to lead towards sounds of violence. The labyrinth was herding us together, forcing confrontations that would provide maximum entertainment for observers I couldn't see but knew were watching. That's when I remembered something Thorn had said about thinking like a predator instead of prey. The witches were hunters, but they were also performers. They needed an audience, needed witnesses to appreciate the artistry of their kills. What if I could deny them that audience? The screaming trees were embedded with faces that watched everything happening in the labyrinth. They were witnesses, but they were also prisoners, trapped souls who had no choice but to observe the entertainment their suffering had helped create. If I could find a way to block their vision, to create areas where the Dark Eldar's artistic murders couldn't be properly observed. I began moving again, but this time with a specific destination in mind. Near the center of the labyrinth, I'd glimpsed what looked like a grove of smaller trees, perhaps young growths that hadn't yet accumulated their full complement of trapped faces. If I could reach that area, I might find space that wasn't under constant observation. The journey through the shifting forest became a nightmare of careful movement and desperate improvisation. Twice, I had to change direction when I heard the distinctive sounds of witches stalking prey in areas I'd intended to cross. Once, I had to remain motionless for what felt like hours, while one of the hunters examined the ground near my hiding place, apparently following some trail that I couldn't see. But I made it to the grove and found something unexpected. The smaller trees weren't young growth. They were something else entirely. Their trunks were smooth and featureless, lacking the embedded faces that marked the larger specimens. And when I pressed against one, I could feel that it was hollow, creating spaces large enough for a human to hide inside. Sanctuary trees. Areas specifically designed to provide temporary shelter for prey that had proven entertaining enough to deserve a chance of extended survival. I climbed inside the nearest hollow trunk, finding myself in a space that was larger than should have been possible given the tree's exterior dimensions. The interior walls were smooth and slightly warm, creating an environment that was almost comfortable compared to the horrors outside. But comfort was a temporary illusion. Through the tree's translucent walls, I could see shapes moving in the forest beyond, witches continuing their hunt, searching for prey that was becoming increasingly scarce as the game progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. I was safe for the moment, but safety in Commorragh was always conditional. The Dark Eldar would let me live as long as I provided entertainment, but eventually they'd expect me to emerge and provide them with fresh opportunities for artistic violence. And in the distance, barely audible through the tree's organic walls, I could hear new sounds approaching. Not the footsteps of hunters, but something heavier, something that suggested the game was entering a new phase. The real predators were coming. The hollow tree provided sanctuary for perhaps an hour before they found me. I'd been listening to the sounds of the hunt growing more distant as the witches tracked down the remaining prisoners one by one. Each death was announced by screams that spoke of artistically prolonged suffering, followed by the musical laughter that seemed to be the Dark Eldar's equivalent of applause. The population of the labyrinth was being systematically reduced, and I was running out of fellow prey to hide among. That's when I heard the new sound. Something like wind chimes made from razor blades, creating harmonies that seemed to cut the air itself. The sound was coming closer, accompanied by footsteps that were somehow both delicate and predatory. "Little Mon Key," called a voice from just outside my hiding place. "I know you're in there." The tree's biometric sensors are quite sophisticated. They report the presence of one scared little human trying very hard not to breathe too loudly. I pressed myself against the tree's inner wall, hoping against hope that the voice belonged to someone who wasn't sure of my location. But even as I tried to remain silent, I could see shadows moving across the translucent barrier that separated me from the nightmare outside. "My name is Lelith Hesperax," the voice continued, and even through the tree's muffling effects, I could hear the pride in those words. "Perhaps you've heard of me. No? How disappointing. I am the greatest of the witch queens, the most perfect killer our species has ever produced. I have performed before the Archons themselves, turned murder into poetry that would make your crude human artists weep with envy." The shadows outside were moving in patterns that spoke of barely contained violence. Whoever this Lelith was She was circling my sanctuary like a predator that had cornered prey and was savoring the anticipation of the kill. "But you," she continued, "you've shown remarkable survival instincts. 7 of my sisters have passed this tree, each one following the scent trails of easier prey. None of them detected your presence, which suggests you've learned to think like one of us." How intriguing. The tree's wall began to dissolve at her touch, its organic structure yielding to her will like flesh parting before a blade. I found myself face to face with perhaps the most beautiful and terrifying creature I'd ever seen. Lelith Hesperax was a perfectly weaponized. Every line of her form spoke of predatory grace refined over millennia of artistic murder. She wore no armor, only silks that seemed to move independently of any wind, and her weapons were extensions of her body, razor-wire whips that writhed like living things, blades that sang with barely contained bloodlust. "There you are," she said, her smile revealing teeth that had been filed to needle points. "The survivor who thinks like prey, but moves like a predator. Do you know how rare that is?" I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The tree's interior had become part of the labyrinth itself, walls melting away to reveal the forest beyond. Other witches emerged from concealment, a hunting pack that had been watching my sanctuary for Emperor knows how long. "Please," Lelith said, raising one perfect hand. "No sudden movements. I haven't decided whether to kill you quickly or slowly, and your behavior will influence that decision considerably." She began to circle me with fluid grace, each step perfectly placed to maintain optimal striking distance. The other Wyches formed a wider circle, ensuring there would be no escape from whatever entertainment their queen had planned. "Tell me," Lelith said conversationally, "what did you think when you first saw Commorragh? Terror? Despair? Some combination of both?" "I thought it was hell," I managed to croak. Her laughter was like silver bells being dropped into a grave. How wonderfully primitive. Hell, a concept from your crude mythology, a place of punishment for sins. But this isn't hell, little monkey. This is art. Everything you've experienced, every moment of suffering you've witnessed, has been carefully orchestrated to create beauty from pain. She paused directly in front of me, close enough that I could see my terrified reflection in her dark eyes. "And you, my dear survival artist, are about to contribute to that beauty in ways you can't imagine." One of her whips moved faster than my eyes could follow, striking across my chest with surgical precision. The pain was immediate and devastating, not just the physical trauma of razored metal cutting flesh, but something deeper. The weapon seemed to interface directly with my nervous system, amplifying every sensation into symphonies of agony. "First movement," Lelith announced to her sisters. "The initial cut that announces the beginning of the performance." Lelith Hesperax was an artist in the truest sense, treating my body like a canvas and pain like paint. Each cut was precise, purposeful, and designed not just to cause agony, but to create specific responses that would enhance the overall composition. She worked with the focused intensity of a master craftsman, pausing between movements to appreciate her work and plan the next phase. "You're learning," she observed during one of these pauses, watching my face with professional interest. "Beginning to understand that resistance is just another form of participation. The more you fight, the more exquisite the symphony becomes." Around us, the other witches provided accompaniment, musical laughter that harmonized with my screams, commentary that treated my suffering like a performance to be critiqued and appreciated. They were connoisseurs of pain, and I was their evening's entertainment. But worse than the physical agony was the growing realization that part of me was beginning to appreciate the artistry involved. Each cut was placed with mathematical precision, every torment calculated to produce specific effects. There was genius in the cruelty, a sophisticated understanding of how consciousness could be manipulated through systematic application of suffering. "There," Lilith said with satisfaction, stepping back to examine her work. "Do you see it? The moment when appreciation begins to eclipse resistance. When the victim starts to understand that they're participating in something greater than their individual existence." I could see my reflection in the polished surface of her blade, and what I saw made my soul recoil. My face bore an expression I didn't recognize, not just pain or terror, but something worse. A kind of aesthetic appreciation that should never exist in human features. "That's the true feast," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher providing instruction. "Not the simple consumption of physical suffering, but the moment when consciousness itself becomes sustenance. When the victim's appreciation of their own torment feeds us more completely than mere screams ever could." She was right, and that was the most horrifying realization of all. Something in me was responding to the artistry of what she was doing, recognizing the skill and creativity involved, even as my body screamed in protest. The Dark Eldar weren't just harvesting pain. They were harvesting the aesthetic appreciation of that pain, feeding on the moment when victims became collaborators in their own destruction. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was pleading for anymore. Release from suffering, or continuation of an experience that was becoming disturbingly meaningful. "Soon," Lilith promised, her smile revealing those filed teeth. "But first, you need to meet someone very special. Someone who will show you what you're destined to become." They brought me to a chamber where madness had been cultivated like a garden. The space was vast, perhaps a cathedral's worth of volume, but filled with structures that defied rational understanding. Cages hung at impossible angles, suspended from points that seemed to exist in dimensions my eyes couldn't track. And in those cages, trapped in states of perfectly preserved insanity, were humans who had progressed beyond mere suffering into realms of experience that had no names. "The graduation gallery," Serene explained, as her racks deposited me in a cage near the chamber's center, where subjects who have proven particularly entertaining are allowed to transcend their original limitations. The occupant of the cage nearest to mine had once been human, but repeated modifications had transformed him into something else entirely. Extra limbs had been grafted onto his torso, each one ending in instruments that he used to perform surgery on himself in an endless cycle of self-improvement. But his face still held traces of human intelligence, and when he looked at me, I saw recognition there. "Brother Marcus," he said in a voice that harmonized with itself. "Third Company, Ultramarines, or I was, before I learned to see beauty in suffering. Now I'm more, an Astartes, one of the Emperor's finest warriors, reduced to this state of willing self-mutilation for the entertainment of aliens." The implications were staggering. If they could break a space marine, what hope did an ordinary human have? "How long?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Time is irrelevant," he replied, one of his grafted hands selecting a blade from the array of instruments embedded in his flesh. "I began the great work 67 years ago, and I'll continue until I achieve perfect understanding of the relationship between consciousness and suffering." He drew the blade across his own arm with practiced precision, watching the blood flow with the focused attention of a scholar studying an important text. There was no pain in his expression, only fascination, as if each new wound revealed fresh insights into mysteries that ordinary minds couldn't comprehend. "That's stage 7, Serene noted with professional interest. "Complete identification with the processes of modification. The subject becomes an active participant in their own transformation. eventually reaching the point where they can't imagine existence without constant enhancement. Around the chamber, other prisoners demonstrated different stages of the process. Some wept constantly, but seemed unable to remember why. Others laughed at jokes that existed only in their reconstructed minds. A few had transcended language entirely, communicating through combinations of screams and gestures that somehow conveyed complex philosophical concepts. "And you," Serene said, settling into her bone chair with obvious satisfaction, "are about to begin your own journey toward transcendence. The physical modifications come late. First, we need to prepare your consciousness for the changes that await." The offer came in the form of a whisper in the dark. I'd been suspended in my cage for what felt like weeks, watching the other prisoners continue their various forms of enthusiastic self-destruction, when a new voice reached me. Not the musical tones of the Dark Eldar, but something older, more alien, speaking in frequencies that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly in my consciousness. "Survival is possible," the voice said, its words forming like crystals of ice in my mind. "But it requires cooperation." The speaker emerged from shadows that seemed deeper than the chamber's lighting should have allowed, a figure that might have been Dark Eldar but was somehow different, older perhaps, or changed by experiences that transcended the normal boundaries of their species. "I am Vectoran the Soul Merchant," it said, its physical voice matching the whispers I'd heard in my head. "And I have a proposition that might interest someone in your precarious position." The other prisoners had fallen silent, their various forms of madness temporarily suspended as they turned to watch the newcomer with expressions of mingled hope and terror. Even the self-modifying Astartes had paused in his work to listen. "3 of your fellow humans have agreed to my terms," Vectoran continued, producing data slates that showed familiar faces. Colonel Thorne, Commander Voss, and Lieutenant Chen, the multi-headed thing that had once been a naval officer. All of them were marked with symbols I didn't recognize, but that made my soul recoil just to look at. They chose cooperation over continuation of their current experiences, the Soul Merchant explained. In exchange for certain services, they've been granted positions of minor authority within Commorragh's hierarchy. They hunt their own species now, but they do so as predators rather than prey. The proposition was simple and horrifying. In exchange for becoming an active participant in the Dark Eldar's hunting expeditions, I would be granted a form of citizenship in their nightmare city. I would survive, possibly for millennia, but only by helping to drag other humans into the same web of suffering that had claimed me. "Consider the alternative," Vectoran said, gesturing toward the other prisoners. "Gradual transformation into something that can no longer be called human, followed by eons of existence as entertainment for creatures whose understanding of art encompasses experiences your current mind cannot process." The silence stretched between us like a physical weight. Around the chamber, the other prisoners watched with expressions that spoke of souls that had already made their choices and were living with the consequences. "I need time to think," I managed. "Of course," Vectoran agreed, its smile revealing teeth that seemed to be made from crystallized darkness. "Take all the time you need. But remember, every moment you delay is another moment of education in the realities of your situation." The grand hunt began with a ceremony that transformed torture into a religious experience. Hundreds of prisoners were gathered in an arena even larger than the one where I'd first fought for survival. But this wasn't a simple gladiatorial combat. This was something more sophisticated, a massive game of survival that would last for days and involve the entire population of captives that Commorragh had accumulated over decades of raiding. The crucible of despair, Archon Vecthara announced, its voice carrying easily across the vast space. Where survival becomes an art form and cooperation becomes a luxury that few can afford. The arena floor was a three-dimensional maze that extended both above and below the entry level, creating a complex environment where tactics and strategy would matter as much as individual combat skill. Hidden throughout the structure were weapons caches, medical supplies, and temporary shelters, resources that would allow extended survival for those clever enough to find them. But the real challenge wasn't the environment, or even the Dark Eldar hunters who would be stalking us. The real challenge was the other prisoners. Each contestant, Vecthara continued, has been equipped with a neural interface that monitors stress levels, emotional states, and survival indicators. Points are awarded not just for personal survival, but for contributing to the suffering of other contestants. The highest scorers will be granted privileges. The lowest will provide alternative entertainment. I found myself grouped with familiar faces: Colonel Thorne, Commander Voss, and others from the collection vaults. But something was wrong with their expressions. They looked at me not as fellow prisoners sharing a common fate, but as potential prey that might provide opportunities for advancement. The modification process is more advanced than you realize, Thorne said quietly, his mechanical limbs clicking as he moved. They don't just change our bodies. They change how we think, how we value things. After enough exposure to their methods, survival becomes more important than humanity. The games began with the release of hunting parties into the maze, not just wyches this time, but creatures that might once have been human, modified beyond recognition, and given fresh opportunities to demonstrate their loyalty to their captors. "Remember," Commander Voss said, as we separated to pursue individual survival strategies, "in here, everyone is prey, and everyone is predator. The only question is which role you'll play when the moment comes to choose." The final entertainment was the cruelest of all, a forced celebration of everything we had lost. The survivors of the Great Hunt, perhaps 20 out of the hundreds who had entered the maze, were gathered in a theater that existed in spaces between dimensions. The architecture defied rational description, creating viewing areas that were simultaneously intimate and vast, allowing the Dark Eldar audience to observe our performance from perspectives that included dimensions I couldn't name. "The Mask of Tears," Serene announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an artist unveiling their masterpiece, where our guests will perform a celebration of their journey from hope to despair, demonstrating their appreciation for the education they've received. We were given costumes that mocked our former identities, Imperial Guard uniforms made from materials that were writhed with their own life, weapons that were beautiful sculptures rather than functional tools, and insignia that proclaimed ranks in armies that no longer existed. "You will dance," Serene commanded, her smile revealing those filed teeth. "You will sing. You will perform for our entertainment, demonstrating your gratitude for the experiences that have brought you to this moment of perfect understanding." The music began with harmonies that seemed to be composed from crystallized screams, rhythms that matched the beating of hearts pushed beyond normal limits, and despite every instinct screaming in protest, I found myself moving to those rhythms, my body responding to commands that bypassed conscious control. Around me, the other survivors performed their own acts of ritualized degradation. We sang songs that celebrated our captors' artistry, danced steps that told the story of our transformation from human to something else, and acted out scenes that portrayed our suffering as transcendent artistic achievement. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, but the growing realization that part of me genuinely appreciated the performance. The Dark Eldar had spent so long reshaping my consciousness that their aesthetic values had become partially integrated into my own thinking. I was applauding my own destruction, finding beauty in experiences that should have been purely horrible. "Perfect," Serene whispered as the performance reached its climax. "Do you see it now? The moment when art transcends suffering and becomes something greater than the sum of its components." Looking out at the audience, thousands of Dark Eldar watching with expressions of aesthetic appreciation, I realized that I did see it, and that understanding was the most terrifying revelation of all. The city of Commorragh revealed its true nature in the slave markets, where consciousness itself was bought and sold like any other commodity. Vast galleries stretched in directions that violated the normal laws of space and time, filled with cages that contained not just physical beings, but extracted memories, crystallized emotions, and refined experiences that had been distilled from centuries of systematic torture. The architecture was a fusion of the organic and the mechanical, creating spaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with unnatural life. I was led through these markets on a chain made from what appeared to be crystallized suffering, each link containing the essence of some victim's final moments of despair. The chain was beautiful in its way, translucent crystal that caught and refracted light in patterns that told stories of transcendent agony. "The economic heart of our civilization," Serene explained, as we passed stalls where merchants displayed their wares with artistic pride, where the harvest of 1,000 worlds is refined into its purest forms and distributed to those with sufficient appreciation for quality. Some stalls contained physical prisoners, humans, Tau, Eldar from the craft worlds, even creatures that might have been space marines. Though they'd been so extensively modified, it was difficult to be certain. But these were the crude merchandise, the raw materials that would be processed into more sophisticated products. The real treasures were less tangible, memories extracted from dying soldiers and preserved in crystal matrices, emotional experiences that had been refined into their purest forms and stored in devices that hummed with barely contained psychic energy. Entire personalities that had been dissected, analyzed, and reconstructed as entertainment software. "That one contains the complete psychological profile of an imperial saint," a merchant explained, pointing to a crystal formation that pulsed with golden light. 7 centuries of accumulated faith, hope, and devotion, experienced from the perspective of someone who genuinely believed the Emperor answered prayers. Quite popular with collectors who appreciate irony. Another stall offered what appeared to be liquid fear in bottles of various sizes. Distilled from the final moments of an entire hive city, the proprietor noted with professional pride. 20 billion souls experiencing terminal despair simultaneously, concentrated into a form that can be consumed for recreational purposes. We moved deeper into the market, past stalls that sold things I couldn't identify and didn't want to understand. The customers were as diverse as the merchandise. Dark Eldar from various castes and hierarchies, creatures that might have been human once, but had been transformed beyond recognition. Beings that existed in dimensions my eyes couldn't properly process. "And here," Serene said, stopping before a stall that seemed somehow different from the others, "is where you'll be making your contribution to our economy." The true scope of the Dark City became apparent as we ascended through its impossible architecture toward whatever fate awaited me in its upper reaches. Commorragh wasn't just a city, it was a pocket universe, a realm that existed in the spaces between realities where the normal laws of physics were more like suggestions than absolute rules. Towers stretched infinitely upward and downward simultaneously, creating skylines that existed in at least 4 dimensions. Districts phased in and out of visible reality, their populations moving between states of existence, like commuters, traveling between different layers of the same nightmare. From the observation platforms built into the transport system, I could see the full magnitude of what the Dark Eldar had created. Entire continents of architecture built from crystallized suffering, oceans of liquid shadow that reflected stars from universes that no longer existed, forests of metallic trees that sang with voices like broken glass, and everywhere, integrated into the very structure of reality itself, were the prisoners, not just contained in cages or bound in chains, but actually built into the city's foundation. Their consciousness had been extracted, refined, and used as raw material for the construction of a civilization that existed primarily to celebrate its own cruelty. "Home," Serene said with obvious pride, gesturing toward vistas that stretched beyond the limits of perception. "The greatest achievement of our species, built in the spaces where reality is thin enough to be shaped by sufficiently artistic minds." The transport carried us through districts dedicated to different aspects of Dark Eldar culture. The academic quarter, where scholars studied the theoretical frameworks underlying various forms of torment. The artisan district, where craftsmen created tools and weapons designed to produce specific types of suffering. The noble reaches, where the most powerful archons maintained palaces built from the crystallized screams of entire worlds. Each district was populated by millions of Dark Eldar who moved through their environment with the easy confidence of beings who had never questioned their right to treat other sentient species as entertainment. They were beautiful, elegant, sophisticated, and absolutely without anything resembling human compassion or morality. "The beauty of Commorragh," Serene continued as we approached our destination, "is that it exists outside normal time. Here, suffering can be extended indefinitely, refined through countless iterations, perfected beyond anything possible in the crude, physical universe." Our transport docked at a platform that seemed to exist in a space between spaces, creating an environment where up and down were matters of personal preference rather than physical law. The structure we entered defied every architectural principle I'd ever encountered, with rooms that were larger on the inside than the outside, corridors that led to themselves, and windows that showed views of places that couldn't possibly exist. "The Palace of Whispered Sorrows," Serene announced as we made our way through halls decorated with living tapestries that told stories of transcendent suffering, where the most refined practitioners of our arts maintain their private collections. The throne room existed in a space that challenged the very concept of dimensionality. I found myself in a chamber that was simultaneously vast and intimate, filled with an audience of Dark Eldar nobles whose forms seemed to shift between states of existence like mirages in heat haze. At the chamber's center, seated on a throne that appeared to be carved from crystallized time itself, was a figure that radiated authority like heat from a furnace. "Asdrubal Vecht," Serene whispered with the reverence typically reserved for religious figures. "Supreme Overlord of Commorragh, the architect of our civilization's greatest glories." The being on the throne was ancient beyond measure, not just old, but existing in a state that transcended normal temporal flow. Its face bore features that might have been beautiful once, but had been refined through millennia of experience into something that was perfect in its cruelty. When it looked at me, I felt my soul being catalogued, analyzed, and filed away for future reference. "The survivor," Vecht said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions I couldn't perceive. "The one who has provided such entertaining resistance to our various educational programs." Around the throne, arranged like decorative elements, were prisoners who had been transformed into living furniture. Humans whose bodies had been modified to serve as chairs, tables, artwork that screamed in harmonious patterns. They were conscious, aware, and utterly helpless, transformed into objects for the convenience of their captors, while retaining enough consciousness to understand their fate. You've shown remarkable adaptability, Vect continued, rising from the throne with fluid grace that seemed to bend space around itself. Surviving situations that should have been fatal, adapting to circumstances that would have broken lesser minds. Such traits are valuable in the right context. The context became clear as figures emerged from alcoves around the chamber's perimeter. I recognized some of them. Colonel Thorne, Commander Voss, others who had accepted Vectoran's bargain and chosen cooperation over continued suffering. But they were changed. Not just physically, though the modifications were extensive, but in ways that went deeper than mere appearance. They moved with the predatory grace that characterized all Dark Eldar, looked at me with eyes that held no trace of human compassion, spoke in voices that carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. Your former comrades have proven quite useful, Vect said with satisfaction. They understand both human psychology and Dark Eldar methodology, making them ideal intermediaries for certain types of hunting expedition. Colonel Thorne stepped forward, his mechanical limbs clicking against the crystal floor. When he spoke, his voice carried tones that belonged more to our captors than to any human I'd ever known. The transition is easier than you might think, he said, his multiple eyes focusing on me with disturbing intensity. The pain fades, eventually, replaced by understanding. You begin to see the artistry in what they do, to appreciate the sophisticated civilization they've built from refined suffering. And the alternative, Commander Voss added, her modified features showing traces of something that might have been sympathy, is continuation of your current educational program until consciousness itself becomes meaningless. The revelation came in the form of a demonstration that redefined my understanding of what existence could become. In a chamber adjacent to the throne room, Vect showed me what awaited prisoners who failed to provide adequate entertainment. The space contained dozens of resurrection chambers, devices that could restore life to the recently dead, bringing back fallen subjects to experience fresh varieties of torment. Death, Vect explained with the tone of a teacher providing important instruction, is a privilege that must be earned through proper appreciation of our artistic methods. Most subjects require multiple deaths before they develop sufficient understanding to merit permanent rest. The chambers were works of art in themselves, crystalline structures that pulsed with energies that seemed to exist in colors beyond normal human perception. Inside each one, suspended in fluids that looked like liquid starlight, were prisoners in various stages of resurrection. That one has died 47 times, Vect noted, pointing to a chamber containing what had once been a space marine. Each death teaches new lessons about the relationship between consciousness and suffering. Each resurrection provides opportunities for fresh educational experiences. The Marine's eyes were open, aware, processing the reality of his situation with the superhuman intellect that marked the Emperor's finest warriors. But there was something broken in those eyes. Not madness exactly, but the kind of spiritual exhaustion that comes from experiencing more horror than any mind was designed to process. The beautiful thing about resurrection technology, Vect continued, is that it preserves not just physical form, but psychological continuity. Each death is remembered in perfect detail, creating cumulative layers of traumatic experience that enhance the overall educational value. Other chambers contain prisoners from across the galaxy, Tau who had died defending their ideals of the greater good, Eldar whose psychic screams had been recorded and analyzed for artistic merit, humans whose final words had been preserved as audio art that played on endless loops. But you, Vect said, turning back to me with renewed interest, have shown sufficient adaptability that multiple deaths might not be necessary. The choice, as always, is yours. The choice was simple: accept transformation into something that could hunt my own species, or experience death and resurrection until I either went insane or learned to appreciate the artistry of my own destruction. How long do I have to decide? I asked. Time is negotiable here, Vect replied, its smile revealing teeth that seemed to be made from crystallized darkness. You can take as long as you need, subjective centuries if necessary. But remember that every moment of delay is another moment of education in the realities of your situation. That was 17 years ago, or 17 centuries. Time moves differently in Commorragh, and I've learned not to think too carefully about the mathematics of eternity. I chose survival not heroically, not after some grand gesture of defiance, but with the quiet pragmatism of a soldier who had run out of options. I accepted Vectran's bargain, allowed the modifications that would let me function as a predator in their nightmare city, and learned to hunt my own species for the entertainment of creatures whose understanding of art encompasses experiences that human language has no words for. The first few hunts were the worst. I told myself I was buying time, looking for opportunities to escape or resist, or somehow strike back at the monsters who had claimed me. But escape from Commorragh is impossible. It exists in spaces between realities, accessible only through webway portals, controlled by the Dark Eldar themselves. And resistance. Resistance becomes meaningless when you begin to understand the sophistication of what they've built. This isn't simple cruelty or psychopathic deviation from normal behavior. This is an entire civilization dedicated to the proposition that consciousness itself can be refined, that suffering is a form of art, that predation is the highest expression of aesthetic appreciation. I've stood in galleries where the screams of dying worlds have been recorded and mixed into symphonies that would make human composers weep with envy. I've watched theatrical performances where the actors are prisoners forced to reenact their own captures, their own moments of greatest despair, over and over, until the performances achieve perfect emotional authenticity. I've learned to appreciate these things. That's the most horrible truth of all. Somewhere in the process of surviving in their city, I've internalized their values. When I see a particularly elegant torture technique, part of me admires the craftsmanship involved. When I hear a well-composed scream, I can analyze its harmonic structure with the educated ear of a trained critic. I'm still human, technically. My DNA remains unchanged, and my basic physiological processes continue to function within acceptable parameters. But humanity is more than biology. It's a way of thinking, a set of values, a commitment to concepts like compassion and mercy, and the inherent dignity of conscious beings. And I've learned to hunt my own species. The humans we bring back to Commorragh are processed through the same systems that claimed me, sorted according to their entertainment potential, subjected to educational programs designed to maximize their suffering while preserving their consciousness. The strong ones become gladiators in the arenas. The intelligent ones are given to the homunculi for more sophisticated experiments. The weak ones are simply fed into the city's infrastructure, their consciousness extracted and used as raw material for architectural projects. And sometimes, very rarely, we encounter humans who show the same survival instincts that I once possessed. When that happens, we're careful to preserve them intact, to ensure they reach Commorragh with their psychological resistance mechanisms still functional. Because the Dark Eldar have learned something important about human psychology. The greatest art comes not from subjects who break quickly, but from those who resist long enough to make their eventual surrender meaningful. I've become very good at identifying such subjects. It's a skill that my captors value highly, and skill means status in their society. Status means better assignments, more comfortable living conditions, and opportunities to participate in hunts that take us to worlds where prey is particularly challenging. Last month, we raided a fortress world called New Cadia. The defenders were everything the original Cadians had been: disciplined, courageous, absolutely committed to their duty to the Emperor. They fought magnificently, died heroically, and provided entertainment that satisfied even the most sophisticated Dark Eldar palates. I found a young Guardsman hiding in the ruins of a command bunker, a soldier who had watched his entire regiment die and was still looking for ways to strike back at the enemies who had claimed his world. He reminded me of someone I used to know, a trooper named Vex Thane, who had survived 17 years of warfare, before learning that survival sometimes requires compromises that destroy everything that made survival worthwhile. I brought him back to Commorragh intact and delivered him to the collection vaults, where he could begin his own educational journey. He's probably in the arena now, or perhaps in one of the homunculi laboratories, learning the same lessons that I learned all those years ago. The hunt never ends. It only changes venues, acquires new prey, and develops fresh methodologies for transforming consciousness into art. And somewhere in the dark between stars, creatures like me continue to stalk through the void, looking for new subjects for our master's entertainment. Because that's what I am now, a creature like them, thinking like them, hunting like them, finding aesthetic appreciation in forms of suffering that would have horrified the person I used to be. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are no heroes. There is only the hunt and the hunted, and the terrible moment when you realize you can no longer tell which category you belong to. The darkness between stars is full of predators, and I am one of them now. Welcome to the eternal hunt.